The tray in Alira's hands trembled as the shattering of glass echoed through the grand hall, and every head turned toward her at once. Wine spread across the marble floor like a dark red wound, and she froze, knowing the punishment for this mistake would not wait until morning. "Clumsy girl," hissed a voice behind her. Though Alira had not been the one to knock the goblet from the table, she had seen the elbow that struck it, seen the smirk on her cousin's face before the glass even left the tray. But no one in this hall would believe a servant over a daughter of the house. She dropped to her knees immediately, gathering the broken shards with bare fingers, ignoring the sharp sting when one bit into her palm. Around her, the ball continued as though nothing had happened, silk gowns swirling past her bent head, laughter rising and falling like waves that never noticed the drowning girl beneath them. Alira had lived 17 years in this pack, and for the last 5 of them, she had lived as a stranger in her own home. Her parents were gone, taken in a single terrible night that the pack elders called an accident, though Alira had never once believed that word. Ever since, she had belonged to her Aunt Marla, a woman who wore kindness like a mask for guests and cruelty like a second skin behind closed doors. "Get up," Marla said now, appearing at Alira's shoulder with her painted smile firmly in place for the watching nobles. Her fingers dug into Alira's arm as she pulled her upright, nails sharp enough to leave marks that would fade by morning, unlike the ones that never did. "You are an embarrassment. Finish your work and stay out of sight for the rest of the evening." Alira nodded, because nodding was easier than arguing, and because arguing had never once worked in her favor. She gathered the tray, the empty goblets, and the last shreds of her dignity, and retreated toward the kitchen corridor where the servants moved like shadows behind the celebration. The ball tonight was unlike any the pack had seen in a generation. Alpha King Draven, ruler of every wolf pack across the northern territories, had called for a gathering of unmated daughters from noble bloodlines, seeking a Luna to stand beside him. Every family with an eligible daughter had spent weeks preparing, sewing gowns, arranging hair, rehearsing curtsies meant to catch a king's eye. Alira's cousin, Freya, had been preparing the longest of all. She had spent 3 days simply choosing which jewels to wear, discarding half her mother's collection as unworthy of the occasion. Freya was beautiful in the way that spoiled things often are, polished on the surface and rotten just beneath, and she had made it clear to everyone in the house that tonight was the night she would be chosen. "Imagine," Freya had said that morning, admiring herself in the hallway mirror while Alira knelt nearby lacing her boots, "being Luna to the most powerful wolf alive. They say he has not smiled once since he took the throne. I intend to be the reason he finally does." Alira had said nothing then, just as she said nothing now, carrying the broken tray toward the kitchen while pretending she did not feel every eye upon her back. She was used to being invisible in rooms full of people who mattered, used to being the shadow that made others look brighter simply by comparison. It should not have hurt anymore. Somehow, it always did. She set the tray down near the kitchen entrance, flexing her cut palm, and allowed herself a single moment to breathe. Through the tall windows lining the corridor, she could see the ballroom beyond, gold light spilling across the dance floor, the king himself seated at the head table like a carved statue that happened to be alive. Draven was younger than she had expected, though she supposed the rumors never mentioned that. He looked perhaps 30, with dark hair cropped close and shoulders built for carrying more weight than any single man should bear. He did not smile, exactly as Freya had said, and he did not seem particularly interested in the parade of hopeful daughters being presented to him one by their eager, ambitious parents. Alira watched him for a moment longer than she should have. There was something in the way he sat, still and controlled, that reminded her of a coiled spring, of a wolf pretending to be calm while every instinct beneath the surface stayed sharp and alert. She wondered, briefly and foolishly, what it might feel like to be looked at by someone like that, truly looked at, the way no one had looked at her since her parents died. Then she remembered herself and turned away, gathering the tray again. A servant did not have the luxury of wondering. "There you are," snapped a voice, and Alira turned to find her younger cousin Lily standing in the corridor, arms crossed, wearing an expression that suggested she had been sent specifically to deliver bad news. "Mother wants you to bring more wine to the corner table, the one near the musicians. And she said to hurry, since apparently you cannot be trusted to carry a simple tray without ruining everything." Alira bit back the urge to point out that she had not broken the goblet at all. There was no point. In this house, the truth mattered less than who was speaking it. "Of course," she said instead, and turned toward the wine cellar. The corridor leading to the cellar was narrower than the main hallways, lit by fewer candles, and Alira welcomed the momentary solitude. She pressed her injured palm against her apron, wincing as the fabric caught the cut, and allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, what her life might have looked like if the fire that took her parents had never happened. Her father had been a respected member of the Pack Council once, a man known for his fairness and his steady judgment. Her mother had been kind to everyone, servants and nobles alike, the kind of woman who remembered the names of children she had only met once. Elira had grown up believing that kindness was rewarded, that fairness meant something in this world. She had learned otherwise very quickly. The fire that killed her parents had been ruled an accident by the Pack elders, a tragic collapse of an old chimney flue in the depths of winter. But Elira remembered small details that never fit that story. She remembered her mother's warning glances toward Marla in the weeks before, remembered overheard arguments about money and inheritance that stopped the moment she entered a room. She remembered, most of all, the strange calm on her aunt's face at the funeral, a calm that looked less like grief and more like relief. She had been 12 years old. No one had listened to a 12-year-old's suspicions then, and no one would listen to a 17-year-old servant's suspicions now. Elira gathered 3 bottles of wine from the cellar shelves, balancing them carefully despite her stinging hand, and made her way back toward the ballroom. As she approached the corner table near the musicians, she noticed the crowd around the head table had shifted, parting slightly, and she caught a glimpse of dark hair and broad shoulders moving in her direction. Her heart lurched, though she could not have said why. Kings did not walk toward servants without reason, and certainly not through crowded ballrooms during their own selection ceremony. She kept her head down and her steps steady, focused entirely on delivering the wine without further disaster. She reached the corner table, set the bottles down with practiced care, and began to pour for the guests seated there, her hands moving through the motion 100 times rehearsed. "You cut yourself," said a voice above her, low and quiet enough that only she could hear it. Elira looked up, startled, and found herself staring directly into the eyes of Alpha King Draven, who had somehow crossed half the ballroom while she was focused on her task, and now stood close enough that she could smell cedar and something wilder beneath it, something that made the hair on her arms rise without warning. "It is nothing, my lord," she said quickly, straightening and tucking her injured hand behind her back, though the movement was clumsy and obvious. "Forgive me for the disturbance earlier. It will not happen again." Draven's dark eyes studied her for a long moment, longer than politeness required, longer than any king had ever looked at her before. There was something searching in his expression, something that made Elira feel as though he were trying to solve a puzzle she did not know she presented. "What is your name?" he asked. The question landed strangely in the noisy hall, quiet as it was, and Elira felt several nearby guests turn their heads at the sound of it. A king did not typically ask the names of serving girls. "Elira, my lord," she answered, keeping her voice steady despite the sudden pounding of her heart. "Elira of the Ashwood House." Something flickered across his face at the mention of her family name, something she could not quite read, gone before she could examine it further. Before he could say anything else, Marla appeared at his side, her smile wide and practiced, inserting herself into the conversation with the ease of long habit. "Your Majesty," Marla said, dipping into a graceful curtsy, "I hope this clumsy girl has not troubled you. She is new to serving at events of this importance. Please, allow me to introduce my daughter Freya, who has been eager to make your acquaintance all evening." Draven's gaze lingered on Elira for one more heartbeat before he turned toward Marla, his expression sliding back into the same carved stillness Elira had noticed from across the hall. "Of course," he said, his voice giving away nothing at all. As Marla steered him toward Freya, who was already curtsying with theatrical grace nearby, Elira remained rooted in place, her empty wine bottles forgotten in her hands, her heart still racing from those few strange seconds of attention. She told herself it meant nothing. Kings noticed servants sometimes, out of simple courtesy or curiosity, and then forgot them just as quickly. But as she turned to make her way back toward the kitchen, she caught him glancing over his shoulder one final time, his dark eyes finding hers across the crowded room, before he was pulled back into the endless parade of introductions. Elira did not know what that look meant. She only knew, with a strange and unfamiliar certainty settling somewhere deep in her chest, that tonight was not going to end the way anyone in this house expected. She had no way of knowing yet how right she was. Back in the kitchen, the air was thick with steam and the smell of roasted meat, and the other servants moved around each other in practiced silence, none of them daring to slow down even for a moment. Elira set the empty bottles on the counter and pressed her back against the cool stone wall, trying to steady her breathing. "You look like you have seen a ghost," said Edmund, an older servant who had worked in the house since before Elira's parents died. He was kind in the quiet way that asked nothing in return, the only person left in the house who still remembered her mother's name without flinching. "The king spoke to me," Elira admitted, still not quite believing the words even as she said them aloud. Edmund's eyebrows lifted, and he set down the tray he had been carrying. Spoke to you? Kings do not speak to serving girls, not unless something has caught their attention. It was nothing, Elira said quickly, though her voice lacked conviction. He asked my name, that is all. That is not nothing, Edmund said quietly, glancing toward the ballroom doors as though he could still see the king through the stone walls. Be careful, child. Attention from someone like him can be a gift or a curse, depending on who is watching when it happens. Elira knew exactly who would be watching. Marla missed nothing that happened in this house, and if she suspected for even a moment that the king's eyes had lingered too long on her niece, there would be consequences. There always were. She forced herself to return to her duties, weaving through the crowded hall with fresh trays of food, refilling glasses, clearing empty plates, doing everything in her power to become invisible again. It was easier than she expected, at first. The nobles barely glanced at her, too absorbed in their own conversations, their own hopes of catching the king's favor before the night ended. But every so often, when she dared to look toward the head table, she found Draven's gaze already resting somewhere near her, quickly redirected the moment their eyes threatened to meet. It happened 3 times before the night was through, each time leaving her more unsettled than the last. Freya, for her part, seemed determined to win the king's attention through sheer persistence. She had positioned herself near his table for most of the evening, laughing loudly at anything resembling a joke, tilting her head at angles she clearly believed to be flattering. Draven responded to her with polite, distant courtesy, the same courtesy he offered every other hopeful daughter paraded before him, and nothing more. As midnight approached and the crowd began to thin, Elira found herself in the corridor near the servants' entrance, gathering her cloak to begin the long walk back to the small room she occupied above the stables. Her feet ached, her palms still throbbed where the glass had cut her, and she wanted nothing more than to close her eyes and forget this strange, unsettling evening had happened at all. She had just reached the door when a shadow fell across her path, and she looked up to find Draven himself standing several feet away, alone in the dim corridor, his guards nowhere in sight. You are leaving, he said, and it was not quite a question. My duties are finished for the evening, my lord, Elira replied carefully, dropping into a shallow curtsy despite her exhaustion. Draven studied her again with that same searching expression from earlier, as though he were trying to place a memory just out of reach. Ashwood, he said slowly. That name was known once, before I took the throne. Your father sat on the Pack Council, did he not? Elira's breath caught in her throat. No one had spoken her father's title aloud in years, not since Marla had made it clear that such conversations were forbidden in her house. He did, my lord, she managed, before he passed. Something shifted behind Draven's eyes, something dark and considering, though he said nothing further about it. Instead, he simply nodded once, as though filing the information away for later use, and stepped aside to let her pass through the door. Good night, Elira of the Ashwood House, he said quietly. She managed only a whispered good night in return before slipping out into the cold evening air, her heart pounding harder than it had all night. Behind her, through the closing door, she thought she heard him murmur something else, something too soft to catch, but she did not turn back to ask. The stars above the stable yard seemed unusually bright as she made her way home, and for the first time in years, Elira allowed herself to wonder if something in her carefully controlled world was about to change forever. A sharp knock on the stable loft door woke Elira before dawn, and she bolted upright, heart hammering, certain for one wild moment that Marla had discovered something terrible during the night. But when she opened the door, it was only Edmund, his face pale in the gray morning light. The king has requested that all household servants report to the main hall within the hour, he said, his voice low with concern. There is talk that he wishes to address something before he departs the territory. Elira's stomach twisted. She had barely slept, replaying the strange corridor conversation over and over in her mind, until the words lost all meaning. Now the king wanted to speak to the servants directly, and she could not shake the feeling that somehow, impossibly, this had something to do with her. She dressed quickly in her plainest uniform, braided her hair with trembling fingers, and followed Edmund down the narrow path toward the main house, joining the small procession of cooks, maids, and stable hands making their way toward the grand hall. Marla and her daughters were already assembled near the front when Elira arrived, and her aunt's eyes found her instantly across the crowded room, narrowing with suspicion. Where were you last night after the ball ended? Marla hissed, catching Elira's arm as she passed. I went straight to my room, Aunt, Elira answered honestly, though she left out the detail of the corridor entirely. Marla's grip tightened for a moment before releasing, and she turned back toward the front of the hall without another word, though her narrowed eyes lingered on Alira for several seconds longer than necessary. The hall itself had been transformed since the previous night, the decorations from the ball stripped away, leaving only bare stone walls and the long table where the king now sat, flanked by two of his personal guards. Draven looked exactly as composed as he had the night before, his expression unreadable, as the assembled household filed in and arranged themselves according to rank, servants toward the back and nobility toward the front. Alira kept her head down, positioning herself near Edmund at the very rear of the gathering, hoping to disappear into the crowd of familiar faces. But as the hall settled into silence, she felt Draven's gaze sweep across the room and land, unmistakably, on her. "I have called this gathering," Draven began, his voice carrying easily through the silent hall without need for effort, "because during my time in this house, certain matters have come to my attention that require clarification." Marla straightened at the front of the room, her expression shifting into practiced concern, as though eager to assist the king with whatever troubled him. Alira felt a cold dread settling into her chest, some instinct warning her that whatever came next would change everything. "I have learned," Draven continued, "that the Ashwood family once held a respected position on this Pax Council, before a tragedy took the lives of both parents 5 years ago. I understand their surviving daughter remains within this household." Every head in the room turned toward Alira at once, and she felt her face flush hot with humiliation, as dozens of eyes settled on her simultaneously. Marla's expression had gone carefully blank, though Alira could see the tension gathering in her aunt's shoulders. "Alira Ashwood," Draven said, addressing her directly now, and she had no choice but to step forward, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. "Approach, please." She made her way toward the front of the hall on legs that did not quite feel like her own, aware of every whisper rippling through the gathered crowd behind her. When she reached the space before the king's table, she dropped into a curtsy, keeping her eyes fixed on the floor. "Tell me," Draven said, his voice gentler now than it had been moments before, though still carrying enough authority to silence the room completely. "What has your life been like in this house since your parents passed?" The question hung in the air like a blade, and Alira felt the weight of every eye upon her, particularly Marla's, which she could feel boring into the side of her face without needing to look up. "I have been fortunate to remain within my family's home, my lord," Alira said carefully, choosing each word with the precision of someone who understood exactly how dangerous honesty could be in this room. Draven's dark eyes studied her for a long moment, and she had the uncomfortable sense that he could see straight through her careful diplomacy to the truth beneath it. "Fortunate," he repeated slowly, as though testing the weight of the word. "And yet last night, I observed a servant with cut hands carrying wine for a household that once called her family equal. Tell me, Alira, is that truly what fortune looks like?" A ripple of shocked murmurs spread through the hall, and Alira felt her carefully maintained composure begin to crack. She glanced up, just briefly, and caught the flash of pure fury behind Marla's practiced smile before her aunt smoothed it away again. "My lord, if there has been any confusion," Marla interjected smoothly, stepping forward with her hands clasped before her. "Alira has always been treated as a beloved member of this family. Perhaps she simply enjoys the satisfaction of contributing to the household in whatever way she can, given her circumstances." "I did not address you," Draven said, and though his voice remained level, something in his tone carried enough weight that Marla actually flinched, taking a small step backward without seeming to realize she had moved at all. He returned his attention to Alira, and for a moment, something almost gentle passed across his features, quickly hidden away again beneath his usual composed authority. "I ask again," he said quietly, "and I would appreciate an honest answer this time. How has your life been in this house?" Alira's throat tightened, torn between years of learned silence and the strange, unfamiliar sensation of being asked a question by someone who genuinely seemed to want the truth. She thought of her parents, of the fairness her father had valued above all things, and found, to her own surprise, that she could not bring herself to lie directly to a man who reminded her so much of that same principle. "It has been difficult, my lord," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, though the silence of the hall carried it to every corner. "But I have survived." Something shifted in Draven's expression at those words, something that looked almost like anger, though Alira understood instinctively that it was not directed at her. He turned his gaze toward Marla, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees despite the summer morning outside. "I will be conducting a formal review of this household's records before my departure," he announced, his voice carrying the finality of a decision already made. All matters pertaining to the Ashwood family's assets, titles, and the circumstances of their deaths will be examined thoroughly. Until such time as this review concludes, Alira Ashwood will remain under the protection of the Crown. The hall erupted into startled whispers, and Marla's face drained of color entirely, though she quickly recovered enough to offer a shaky curtsy of acknowledgement. Alira herself felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet, uncertain whether to feel relief or terror at the sudden, dramatic reversal of her circumstances. "Thank you, my lord," she managed, though the words felt inadequate for the magnitude of what had just happened. Draven rose from his seat, and the entire hall rose with him out of respect, servants and nobility alike bending in unison. "You will be moved to guest quarters within the main house immediately," he said, addressing one of his guards rather than Alira directly now, though his eyes flickered back to her once more before he turned to leave. "See that she is given proper care." As the king departed the hall with his guards trailing behind him, the assembled household dissolved into a buzz of astonished conversation, and Alira found herself standing alone near the front of the room, still trying to process the impossible turn her morning had taken. Marla approached moments later, her expression carefully composed into something resembling warmth, though her eyes remained cold as winter stone. "Well," Marla said quietly, close enough that only Alira could hear her, "it seems you have made quite an impression, niece. I do hope you remember who has cared for you all these years, once this royal curiosity passes, and you find yourself back where you belong." The threat was clear enough despite its gentle delivery, and Alira felt the familiar cold weight of fear settle back into her chest, even amid the strange new hope blooming there. She had survived Marla's cruelty for 5 years by staying quiet and small, and she understood, with sudden clarity, that whatever came next would require a very different kind of courage entirely. As she was led toward the guest quarters by a young attendant she barely recognized, Alira glanced back once toward the hall doors through which Draven had departed, wondering what exactly had drawn a king's attention to a servant girl with cut hands and a forgotten name, and wondering, with a mixture of hope and dread she could not quite separate, what he intended to do about it. The guest quarters were unlike anything Alira had experienced since childhood, a spacious room with tall windows overlooking the eastern gardens, a bed larger than the entire loft she had slept in above the stables, and furniture polished to a gleaming shine that reflected the morning sunlight. The young attendant, a girl named Beatrice who could not have been much older than 15, moved about the room with nervous energy, arranging fresh linens and drawing back the heavy curtains. "I have never attended a guest of the Crown before," Beatrice admitted, her hands fumbling slightly with a vase of fresh flowers. "Is it true the king himself requested you be moved here?" "It seems so," Alira said quietly, still standing near the doorway, as though she expected someone to appear and tell her this had all been a terrible mistake. "They say he has never shown interest in anyone at these gatherings before," Beatrice continued, clearly unable to contain her curiosity despite her nervousness. "My mother works in the kitchens, and she told me the king usually sits through these balls like a statue, barely speaking to anyone. But last night, she said he asked about you 3 separate times." Alira felt heat rise in her cheeks at the confirmation of what she had already suspected but had not dared to fully believe. "I am certain it means nothing," she said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Beatrice gave her a look that suggested she did not believe that for a moment, but she said nothing further, simply finishing her arrangement of the room and offering a small curtsy before departing to attend to other duties. Alone for the first time since the hall, Alira sank onto the edge of the enormous bed, running her fingers over the soft blankets, and allowed herself to finally process the whirlwind of the morning. Her mind kept returning to the moment Draven had spoken her father's name aloud, the way his expression had shifted with something that looked almost like recognition, as though the Ashwood name carried meaning for him beyond simple pack records. She thought of her father often, though the memories had grown softer and more distant over the years, worn smooth like river stones. He had been a serious man, careful with his words and generous with his time, the kind of council member who listened more than he spoke. She remembered him kneeling beside her in the garden once, explaining that true strength was found not in power over others but in fairness toward them, even when fairness was difficult. She wondered what he would think of her now, still surviving in the same house that had stolen everything from her, still uncertain whether the sudden kindness of a king represented genuine hope or simply another complication in a life already full of them. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, and she rose to find one of Draven's personal guards standing in the hallway, his expression carefully neutral in the way of someone trained to reveal nothing. "The king requests your presence in the eastern study, if you are willing," the guard said, his tone respectful despite its formality. "There is no obligation. He wished me to make that clear." Alira's heart began to race again. Though whether from nerves or something else entirely, she could not have said. Of course, she replied, smoothing her simple servant's dress with hands that trembled slightly. I will come immediately. The guard led her through unfamiliar corridors of the main house, past portraits of Pack ancestors she did not recognize, and rooms she had cleaned but never truly seen, until they reached a small study tucked away from the more formal chambers. The guard knocked once, then opened the door and stepped aside to let her enter, before closing it quietly behind her. Draven stood near the window, his back to her, looking out over the same gardens visible from her new quarters. He had removed his formal coat from the previous night, wearing instead a simpler shirt that somehow made him look less like a king and more like an ordinary man carrying an extraordinary burden. "Thank you for coming," he said without turning, and Alira noted the slight change in his voice now that they were alone, something less guarded than the authority he had projected in the hall. "You wish to speak with me, my lord," Alira said, unsure of the proper protocol for a private meeting with a king, uncertain whether to remain standing or wait for permission to sit. Draven finally turned to face her, and for the first time since she had met him, his expression seemed almost uncertain, as though he too were navigating unfamiliar territory. "I owe you an explanation," he said, "for the manner in which I addressed things this morning. It was not my intention to embarrass you further in front of your household." "You have nothing to apologize for, my lord," Alira said quickly, surprised by his admission. "You have shown me more kindness in one morning than I have received in 5 years." Something flickered across his face at those words, something that looked like quiet anger, directed entirely at circumstances rather than at her. "That should never have been true," he said. "No daughter of a council member should live as you have lived, regardless of what tragedy befell her family." Alira did not know how to respond to that, so she said nothing, simply watching him as he moved to sit behind the study's modest desk, gesturing for her to take the chair opposite him. "I will be honest with you, Alira," he said once she had settled into the seat, folding her hands carefully in her lap. "Last night, when I first noticed you, it was not simple curiosity that drew my attention. There was something else, something I have not yet fully understood myself. I intend to discover the truth of it, along with the truth of what happened to your parents, before I leave this territory." The weight of his words settled over her slowly, and Alira found herself unable to look away from his steady gaze, wondering exactly what kind of truth a king might be searching for in a servant girl's presence, and wondering, with growing unease, whether she was truly prepared for whatever answer he might find. The scent hit Draven the moment Alira stepped into the study, and he had to grip the edge of his desk to keep his composure from slipping in front of her. It was not the first time he had noticed it, that strange, warm fragrance beneath her simple servant's clothes, something like fresh rain and wild honey, that no perfume could ever replicate. But standing this close to her, alone in a quiet room without the noise of the hall to distract him, the pull became undeniable. He had heard the old stories his whole life, tales passed down through generations of alpha lineage, of a bond between two wolves so complete that scent alone could announce it before either party understood what was happening. He had dismissed such stories as convenient legends, comforting fictions meant to soften the reality that most alphas chose their mates for strategic alliance, rather than any mystical connection. He had never expected to experience it himself, certainly not with a servant girl he had known for less than a day. "My lord?" Alira asked, noticing his distraction, her brow furrowing slightly with concern. "Forgive me," Draven said, forcing his attention back to the conversation at hand. "I was considering how best to proceed with the investigation into your parents' deaths." It was not entirely a lie, though it was far from the complete truth occupying his thoughts. He needed time to understand what was happening within himself before he said anything that might frighten or confuse her further, particularly given everything she had already endured that morning. "I appreciate your concern, my lord," Alira said, "but I do not wish to cause trouble within my aunt's household. She has cared for me, in her own way, since my parents passed." Draven studied her carefully, noting the careful diplomacy in her words, the practiced way she defended a woman who had clearly caused her considerable suffering. It reminded him of himself in certain moments, the way duty and survival often required presenting a version of truth more palatable than reality. "I do not believe that to be entirely accurate," he said gently, "but I will not press you to speak against her if you are not ready. However, I intend to review the pack records regarding your parents' estate and the circumstances surrounding their deaths, regardless of your aunt's feelings on the matter. This is within my authority as Alpha King, and it is a review long overdue." Alira's hands tightened in her lap, and Draven could see the war playing out behind her eyes, years of learned caution battling against a flicker of hope she seemed almost afraid to acknowledge. "What do you hope to find, my lord?" she asked quietly. "The truth," he said simply. whatever that may be. A comfortable silence settled between them for a moment, broken only by the distant sound of birds in the garden beyond the window. Draven found himself studying her more closely than propriety probably allowed, noting the quiet strength in the set of her shoulders despite everything she had endured, the intelligence behind her careful words, the way she seemed to weigh every response before offering it, a habit born of necessity rather than natural reserve. "May I ask you something, my lord?" Elira said finally, breaking the silence. "Of course. Why does it matter to you?" she asked, her voice carrying genuine confusion rather than accusation. "You are the Alpha King of all Northern Territories. You have pacts to govern, alliances to maintain, a Luna to select from a hall full of noble daughters eager for your attention. Why would the circumstances of one servant girl's family matter to someone with such enormous responsibilities?" It was a fair question, and one Draven had been asking himself since the previous night without finding a satisfactory answer he was willing to voice aloud. The truth, that some instinct deeper than logic had recognized her as significant before he understood why, felt too strange and too soon to share with someone who had every reason to distrust sudden royal attention. "Because fairness matters to me," he said instead, which was also true, simply not the whole of it. "My own father taught me that a ruler who ignores injustice within his own territories has no right to demand loyalty from those he governs. If something happened to your family that was not properly investigated, it is my duty to correct that oversight, regardless of your current position within this household." Elira nodded slowly, though Draven could see she remained uncertain whether to fully trust his explanation. He could hardly blame her caution, given everything she must have learned about the unreliability of powerful people during her years of quiet suffering. "There is something else I must ask you," he continued, deciding to shift toward more immediate concerns. "Your aunt mentioned this morning that you have always been treated as a beloved member of the family. I did not believe her. I would like to hear, in your own words and without fear of consequence, what your life has truly been like since your parents' deaths." Elira was quiet for a long moment, and Draven waited patiently, understanding instinctively that pressing her further would only cause her to retreat deeper into practiced diplomacy. Finally she began to speak, her voice quiet but steady, describing years of servitude disguised as family obligation, of meals eaten alone in the kitchen while her cousins dined at the family table, of clothing handed down until it fell apart before new garments were provided, of the countless small cruelties that added up over time into something far larger than any single incident could convey. Draven listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening with barely contained anger, as the picture became clearer, a portrait of systematic cruelty disguised beneath the veneer of family obligation. By the time she finished, the sun had shifted noticeably through the study window, and Draven found himself gripping the edge of his desk hard enough that his knuckles had gone pale. "Thank you for trusting me with this," he said quietly, once he had regained sufficient control to speak evenly. "You will not return to that treatment, Elira. I give you my word." "My lord, I do not wish to be a burden on the crown's resources," Elira said quickly, clearly uncomfortable with the weight of his promise. "I am capable of managing my own circumstances. I have done so for 5 years already." "You have survived circumstances that should never have existed in the first place," Draven corrected gently. "There is a considerable difference between surviving and living, Elira. I intend to see that you have the opportunity for the latter, regardless of what my investigation ultimately reveals." She looked at him then with an expression he could not entirely interpret, somewhere between gratitude and disbelief, as though she could not quite reconcile the kindness of his words with everything her experience had taught her to expect from those in positions of power. "Why?" she asked again, softer this time, and Draven understood she was asking the same question as before, still searching for the answer he had not yet been willing to give. He held her gaze for a long moment, weighing the wisdom of honesty against the complications it would certainly introduce. Finally he settled on a partial truth, enough to acknowledge what he could not yet fully explain, without overwhelming her with claims she had no reason yet to believe. "Because something about you feels important to me," he said carefully. "In a way I do not yet fully understand myself. I ask only that you allow me the time to investigate both your family's circumstances and my own instincts, before either of us draws conclusions about what any of this means." Elira's cheeks colored slightly at his words, and she looked away toward the window, though Draven caught the small, uncertain smile that crossed her lips before she could fully hide it. It was the first genuine emotion he had seen from her since their conversation began, and something in his chest tightened at the sight of it, a warmth entirely unfamiliar to a man who had spent years training himself to feel very little at all. "I would be willing to allow that, my lord," she said quietly, "though I confess I do not know what to expect." "Neither do I," Draven admitted, and found, to his own surprise, that the honesty of that statement felt like a relief rather than a weakness. Outside the study window, the afternoon light continued to shift across the gardens, indifferent to the quiet transformation occurring within, unaware that a bond neither of them fully understood yet was already beginning to take root, stronger with every passing moment they spent in each other's company. Later that evening, after Alira had returned to her guest quarters and the household had settled into its usual evening routine, Draven remained in the study alone, staring at the papers his advisor had brought him regarding the Ashwood family estate. The documents were sparse, oddly incomplete for records of a council member's death, and several entries had clearly been altered or removed entirely, leaving gaps that told their own quiet story. His advisor, a steady older wolf named Nathaniel who had served the crown for 3 decades, entered the study carrying an additional stack of papers, his expression grim in the candlelight. "You wish to see the full financial records, my lord," Nathaniel said, setting the papers on the desk before him. "I must tell you, what I have found so far raises considerable concern." "Explain," Draven said, setting aside the incomplete death records to focus fully on his advisor's report. "The Ashwood estate was substantial before the parents' deaths," Nathaniel explained, pulling out several ledgers and pointing to specific entries. "Land holdings, savings accumulated over 3 generations, a modest but respected standing within the Pax Council. Following the deaths, however, the entirety of that estate was transferred to the guardianship of Marla Ashwood, the deceased mother's sister by marriage, under the justification of managing it on behalf of the surviving daughter until she came of age." "That seems reasonable enough on its surface," Draven said carefully, though something in Nathaniel's tone suggested there was more to the story. "It would be reasonable," Nathaniel agreed, "except that Alira came of age 18 months ago, my lord, according to PAC records. The estate should have been transferred back to her control at that time. Instead, the guardianship arrangement was quietly extended by Marla herself, using documentation that appears, upon closer inspection, to be forged." Draven felt a cold fury settle over him at this confirmation of what he had already begun to suspect. "Forged how?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm despite the anger building beneath it. "The signature purporting to be Alira's consent to extend the guardianship does not match samples of her actual handwriting that I was able to obtain from earlier PAC correspondence," Nathaniel explained. "It appears Marla has been managing, and by all indications, systematically depleting the Ashwood estate for her own family's benefit, for well over a year without any legal right to do so." "And the deaths themselves?" Draven asked. "What do the original investigation records show?" Nathaniel's expression grew even more troubled. "That is perhaps the most concerning discovery of all, my lord. The original investigators' notes, which should have been preserved in the PAC archive, are missing entirely. Only the final summary report remains, the one ruling the fire an accidental chimney collapse. There is no record of witness statements, no documentation of the physical evidence examined, nothing beyond the bare conclusion itself." "Missing or removed," Draven said grimly. "I could not say with certainty, my lord, though the timing is suspicious. The records vanished from the archive approximately 4 years ago, not long after Marla assumed permanent guardianship over both Alira and the estate." Draven sat back in his chair, processing the implications of everything Nathaniel had uncovered. A council member and his wife dead under circumstances with no properly preserved investigation, an estate systematically stolen from its rightful heir through forged documentation, and a young woman kept in servitude within her own family home for years, while her aunt profited from her suffering. It painted a picture far darker than simple negligent guardianship. "I want a full investigation reopened into the deaths themselves," Draven said finally. "Discreetly, for now. I do not wish to alert Marla Ashwood to the extent of what we have already discovered, until we have gathered sufficient evidence to act decisively." "Understood, my lord," Nathaniel said, gathering the papers back into their folders. "Might I ask, if you do not mind the question, why this particular case has captured your attention so thoroughly? The Crown investigates matters of injustice throughout the territories regularly, yet I have rarely seen you dedicate such immediate personal focus to a single household's affairs." Draven considered his answer carefully, unwilling to fully explain the strange pull he felt toward Alira even to his most trusted advisor, not until he understood it better himself. "Every injustice deserves attention, Nathaniel," he said instead, which was true even if incomplete. "This one simply happened to cross my path at the right moment for me to act upon it." Nathaniel nodded, apparently satisfied with the explanation, though Draven suspected the older wolf's keen instincts had picked up on more than he let on. "I will continue the investigation and report back within a few days, my lord," Nathaniel said, moving toward the door. "In the meantime, I would advise caution regarding Marla Ashwood, a woman capable of forging legal documents and potentially concealing the truth behind her own family's deaths. is unlikely to accept scrutiny without resistance. I am aware, Draven said quietly, thinking of the sharp calculation he had noticed behind Marla's practiced smile that morning. I intend to proceed carefully, for Alira's sake as much as for the sake of uncovering the truth. After Nathaniel departed, Draven remained alone in the study long into the evening, the candlelight flickering low as he reviewed the incomplete records once more, searching for any additional detail that might illuminate the truth behind the tragedy that had shaped Alira's entire adult life. Somewhere within this house, he suspected, the real story of what happened to her parents remained hidden, waiting to be uncovered by someone finally willing to look for it. He thought of Alira's quiet strength as she had described her years of suffering, the careful diplomacy she had maintained even while defending a woman who had clearly wronged her, and felt his resolve harden further. Whatever the investigation ultimately revealed, he intended to see justice done, both for the sake of the truth itself and for the sake of the young woman whose scent still lingered curiously in his memory, refusing to be forgotten no matter how hard he tried to focus on the practical matters at hand. Marla's hands shook as she gathered the scattered ledgers from her private study, hastily stuffing them into a locked cabinet before her husband's cousin, a minor pack official named Gerald, could catch sight of the numbers scrawled across the pages. Word had spread quickly through the household that the king's advisor had been asking pointed questions among the staff, questions about old records, about the Ashwood estate, about the night of the fire itself. She had known this moment might come eventually, though she had allowed herself to believe, foolishly perhaps, that enough time had passed for the truth to remain safely buried. 5 years was a long time. Long enough, she had thought, for memories to soften, for questions to fade, for a household of frightened servants to forget whatever small details they might have witnessed on that terrible night. But she had not accounted for a king's sudden, inexplicable interest in her niece. "Mother," Freya said, appearing in the study doorway with her arms crossed, her expression tight with barely concealed frustration. "The whole house is talking about nothing except Alira. It is humiliating. I spent months preparing for that ball, and now everyone whispers about the king asking after a servant girl instead of the daughters actually presented to him." "I am aware, Freya," Marla snapped, more sharply than she intended, though her nerves had been fraying steadily since that morning's hall gathering. "This is a temporary curiosity. Kings grow bored quickly. Once his investigation finds nothing of significance, he will move on to more important matters, and things will return to normal." "Will they?" Freya asked, her voice carrying an edge of doubt. "You always told me that Alira's parents' affairs were settled long ago. If there is nothing to find, why do you look so frightened?" Marla's composure cracked for just a moment, long enough for Freya to see something dark and calculating flash across her mother's face before it smoothed away again. "I am not frightened," Marla said firmly. "I am simply cautious, as any responsible guardian would be when powerful outsiders begin poking through private family matters. There are things about that estate, financial complexities, that are simply nobody's business but our own." Freya studied her mother for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted from frustration to genuine unease, as though she were beginning to consider questions she had never before thought to ask. "Mother," she said slowly, "what exactly happened the night of the fire?" "That is quite enough," Marla said, her voice suddenly cold. "I will not have you questioning me in my own house, Freya. Whatever happened that night was a tragedy, nothing more. I would advise you to focus your energy on more productive matters, such as securing your own position within this pack, rather than dwelling on ancient history that no longer concerns us." "Quest." Freya's jaw tightened, but she said nothing further, retreating from the study with an expression Marla did not particularly care to examine too closely. She had more pressing concerns at the moment than her daughter's sudden crisis of conscience. Alone once more, Marla poured herself a measure of wine with trembling hands and sat heavily in her favorite chair, trying to think through the situation with the clarity it demanded. The forged guardianship documents were the most immediate danger, she knew. If the king's advisor examined Alira's actual signature closely enough, the forgery would become obvious, and there would be no reasonable explanation she could offer for its existence. She needed to act quickly, before the investigation progressed any further. Perhaps, she thought, sipping her wine with forced calm, there was still a way to salvage this situation before it spiraled entirely beyond her control. Meanwhile, in the guest quarters across the house, Alira sat by her window, watching the afternoon shadows lengthen across the eastern gardens, her mind still turning over everything Draven had said during their conversation in the study. She had not expected honesty from him, had braced herself throughout their meeting for some hidden agenda to eventually reveal itself, some ulterior motive behind his sudden interest in her circumstances. Instead, he had offered something she had almost forgotten how to recognize: genuine concern, offered without expectation of anything in return. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts, and she rose to find Beatrice standing in the doorway, her young face pale with obvious worry. "What is it?" Elira asked, immediately sensing that something had gone wrong. "Your aunt requests your presence in her private study," Beatrice said quietly, glancing nervously down the corridor as though checking for eavesdroppers. "She says it is urgent, and that you should come alone, without mentioning it to any of the king's household staff." Elira's stomach tightened with familiar dread. She had learned long ago that when Marla requested privacy and secrecy in the same breath, nothing good typically followed. But she also understood that avoiding the summons entirely would likely create more problems than facing it directly. "Thank you, Beatrice," she said, forcing calm into her voice she did not entirely feel. "I will go to her now." The walk toward Marla's private study felt longer than usual, every step accompanied by a growing sense of foreboding that Elira could not quite shake. When she finally arrived and knocked at the heavy wooden door, Marla's voice called out immediately for her to enter, sounding strained despite its attempt at normalcy. Inside, Marla sat behind her desk, several documents spread before her, her expression carefully arranged into something resembling maternal concern, though Elira had learned years ago to distrust that particular mask entirely. "Close the door, dear," Marla said, gesturing toward a chair across from her desk. "We have important matters to discuss." Elira complied, closing the door quietly before taking the offered seat, her eyes drawn immediately to the documents scattered across the desk's surface, though she could not quite make out their contents from her position. "I understand the king has taken a personal interest in your circumstances," Marla began, folding her hands carefully atop the desk. "I want you to know, Elira, that I have always considered you a daughter, despite the practical necessities of our household arrangement. Whatever difficulties you may have experienced, they were never intended maliciously." "Aunt Marla," Elira began, unsure where this conversation was heading but sensing it would require careful navigation. "Please, let me finish," Marla interrupted, her voice taking on an edge of desperation she quickly smoothed away. "I am concerned that the king's investigation, however well-intentioned, may uncover complexities regarding the estate's management that could be easily misunderstood without proper context. Financial matters can appear complicated to those unfamiliar with the practical realities of managing a household's assets over many years." Elira remained silent, watching her aunt carefully, aware that whatever Marla was building toward would require significant care in how she responded. "I would ask, as a favor to the family that raised you," Marla continued, her voice softening into something almost pleading, "that you speak to the king on my behalf. Perhaps you might suggest that his investigation is unnecessary, that whatever occurred regarding the estate was simply the natural complexity of managing family finances during difficult circumstances. It would mean a great deal to me, Elira, and to your cousins, who have done nothing to deserve the scrutiny this investigation might bring upon our household's reputation." Elira studied her aunt's face carefully, recognizing the desperation hidden beneath the careful words, understanding for the first time just how much Marla feared what the investigation might reveal. 5 years of quiet suffering suddenly crystallized into a single, clarifying thought. Her aunt was afraid, genuinely afraid, of what the truth might expose. "I cannot make such promises, Aunt Marla," Elira said finally, her voice steadier than she expected it to be. "If there is nothing improper in how the estate was managed, then the investigation should reveal exactly that, and there is no need for concern. But I will not ask the king to abandon his pursuit of truth, simply to protect this family from scrutiny it may or may not deserve." Marla's expression shifted rapidly through several emotions, surprise giving way to anger, and finally settling into something cold and calculating that made Elira's skin prickle with old, familiar fear. "I see," Marla said quietly. "After everything this family has provided for you, this is how you choose to repay us." "I have repaid this family many times over with 5 years of labor for which I was never compensated," Elira said, surprising herself with the sudden boldness of her own words, emboldened perhaps by the memory of Draven's steady support that morning. "I will not apologize for wanting the truth about my parents' deaths, Aunt Marla, regardless of what that truth might mean for this household's reputation." The silence that followed felt heavy, with unspoken threat, and Elira rose from her chair, understanding instinctively that nothing productive would come from remaining in this room a moment longer. As she reached the door, Marla's voice called out behind her, quiet and cold enough to raise the hair on Elira's arms. "Be careful, Elira," Marla said. "Kings are fickle creatures, and royal attention fades quickly once the novelty wears thin. When that happens, you will find yourself back in this house, dependent once again on the family you have chosen to betray today." Elira did not respond, simply closing the door quietly behind her as she stepped back into the corridor, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and something new, something that felt almost like the first fragile edges of hope beginning to take root despite her aunt's warnings. She made her way back toward the guest quarters with unsteady steps, her mind racing through everything that had just transpired. There had been something different in Marla's desperation this time, something more urgent than the usual manipulative concern her aunt typically employed. Elira found herself replaying the conversation, searching for details she might have missed, and settled on one troubling realization. Marla had never once denied that something improper had occurred with the estate. She had only asked Elira to help conceal it. As she rounded a corner in the main corridor, she nearly collided with Nathaniel, the king's advisor, who caught her gently by the shoulders to steady her before she could stumble. "Forgive me," Elira said quickly, stepping back and offering a small curtsy despite her scattered thoughts. "I was not paying proper attention to my surroundings." "No harm done," Nathaniel said kindly, though his sharp eyes studied her face with obvious concern. "You look troubled, Miss Ashwood. Has something happened?" Elira hesitated, uncertain how much she should share, mindful of Marla's warning still echoing in her ears. But something in Nathaniel's steady, patient expression reminded her of the trust Draven had extended earlier that day, and she found herself wanting to extend the same courage now. "My aunt asked me to speak with the king on her behalf," Elira said carefully, "to suggest that his investigation into the estate is unnecessary." She seemed quite anxious about it. Nathaniel's expression sharpened with interest, though he kept his tone carefully neutral. "Did she offer any explanation for her anxiety?" "She spoke of financial complexities that might be easily misunderstood," Elira said, though she never explained what those complexities actually were. "I see," Nathaniel said thoughtfully. "Thank you for telling me this, Miss Ashwood. It may prove useful to our investigation. I would ask, if you are willing, that you continue to inform either myself or the king directly of any similar conversations, should your aunt approach you again on this matter." Elira nodded, feeling a strange mixture of guilt and relief at having shared the information, as though she had finally taken a small step toward the truth her father had always valued so highly. "I will," she said quietly. "I only wish to understand what truly happened to my parents, whatever that truth may be." "That is a wish worthy of respect," Nathaniel said, his expression softening slightly. "The king shares that same determination, I assure you. He does not undertake such investigations lightly, nor does he abandon them once begun." After Nathaniel continued on his way, Elira made her way back to her quarters, the weight of the day's events settling heavily upon her shoulders. She sat by the window once more, watching the sun begin its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the eastern gardens in shades of gold and amber that seemed almost too beautiful for a day that had carried so much tension within it. She thought of her father again, wondering if he had ever suspected, in those final weeks before the fire, that his own sister-in-law might pose a threat to his family's safety and prosperity. She thought of her mother's warning glances toward Marla that she remembered from childhood, glances that had seemed mysterious and unexplained at the time, but now carried a weight of foreboding she had never fully appreciated. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts once more, and this time, when she opened the door, she found Draven himself standing in the corridor, his expression carrying a seriousness that suggested he had already learned something of her conversation with Marla. "May I come in?" he asked, and Elira stepped aside to allow him entry, closing the door quietly behind him. "Nathaniel informed you already," she said, not quite a question. "He did," Draven confirmed, moving to stand near the window where she had been sitting moments before. "I wanted to see for myself that you were unharmed after that conversation. Your aunt's desperation concerns me, particularly given what my investigation has already uncovered." "What have you found?" Elira asked, her heart quickening with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Draven hesitated for a moment, clearly weighing how much to share before the investigation had fully concluded. "Enough to confirm my suspicions that your aunt has not been entirely truthful about the management of your family's estate," he said finally. "I do not wish to share incomplete conclusions with you before we have gathered sufficient evidence, Elira, but I want you to know that whatever we discover, you will not face the consequences of it alone." Something in his steady, quiet promise settled deep into Elira's chest, warming places that had gone cold and guarded for years under Marla's careful cruelty. She looked up at him, studying the sincerity in his dark eyes, and found herself, for the first time since her parents' deaths, allowing herself to believe that someone truly meant to help her without expecting anything in return. "Thank you," she said softly, and Draven's expression shifted into something almost tender, a rare crack in his otherwise composed royal bearing that she suspected very few people had ever been permitted to witness. "You do not need to thank me for simply doing what is right," he said quietly. "But you are welcome all the same." As the sun continued its slow descent outside her window, casting long shadows across the guest quarters where she now resided, Alira allowed herself, cautiously, to hope that the truth her family deserved might finally be within reach, and that whatever storm was building around her aunt's careful deceptions, she would not have to weather it entirely alone. The old woman's hands shook as she poured tea for her unexpected visitor, her eyes darting nervously toward the small cottage window as though she expected someone to be watching from the shadows outside. Nathaniel had traveled 2 full days to reach this remote corner of the territory, following a lead buried deep within the Pack Archive's oldest correspondence, a single mention of a witness who had reportedly seen something unusual on the night of the Ashwood fire. "I have not spoken of that night in 5 years," the woman said, setting the teapot down with trembling hands. Her name was Clara, and she had once served as a maid within the Ashwood household, before quietly relocating to this distant village shortly after the tragedy occurred. "I did not think anyone would ever ask again." "I understand this may be difficult," Nathaniel said gently, "but the king himself has requested a full accounting of what happened that night. Anything you can tell me would be greatly valued, and I assure you, your safety will be protected regardless of what you share." Clara's eyes filled with tears, and she wrung her hands together in her lap for a long moment before finally speaking. "I was tending to the household linens that night, in the servants' quarters at the rear of the main house," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I could not sleep, so I was awake near the window when I saw Marla Ashwood leaving the main house well after midnight, carrying something wrapped in cloth. She walked toward the chimney flue that fed the master bedroom, the very one that was later blamed for the fire." Nathaniel remained perfectly still, not wanting to interrupt the fragile flow of memory finally being released after years of forced silence. "What happened next?" he asked quietly. "I did not think much of it at the time," Clara admitted, wiping at her eyes. "I assumed she was simply attending to some household matter, but the following morning, when the fire broke out and the master's chamber filled with smoke before anyone could escape, I remembered what I had seen, and grew frightened. When I mentioned it to the household steward, I was told, quite firmly, that I must have been mistaken, that grief and shock were confusing my memory. But you were not mistaken," Nathaniel said carefully. "I know what I saw," Clara said, her voice gaining a fragile strength, despite her obvious fear. "Within a week, I was dismissed from service entirely, given a generous sum of money I had not requested, and told that opportunities in this village would suit me better than continued service in the Ashwood household. I understood the message clearly enough. I was being paid to forget what I had seen, and I was frightened enough of what might happen if I refused that I took the money and left without ever speaking of it again." Nathaniel's jaw tightened with barely contained anger at the confirmation of what he had already begun to suspect. "Would you be willing to provide a formal statement of what you witnessed, before the Pack Council?" he asked. "Your safety would be guaranteed under the Crown's protection, and your courage in coming forward would finally allow the truth to be properly acknowledged." Clara hesitated for a long moment, clearly weighing years of accumulated fear against the possibility of finally releasing a secret that had haunted her ever since that terrible night. "The Ashwood daughter," she said finally. "The little girl who lost her parents. Is she safe? Is she well?" "She is under the Crown's direct protection as we speak," Nathaniel assured her. "The king himself has taken a personal interest in ensuring her well-being and uncovering the truth of what happened to her family." Something shifted in Clara's expression at this news, relief mixing with a resolve that had clearly been building throughout their conversation. "Then yes," she said firmly, "I will provide my statement. That poor child deserves to know the truth, whatever the cost to my own safety might be." Nathaniel thanked her profusely, arranging for a formal statement to be recorded before his departure, along with assurances of protection that he intended to see personally enforced upon his return to the Pack's main territory. As he rode back toward the Ashwood estate over the following 2 days, he found himself contemplating how to best present this devastating new evidence to the king, understanding that it would change everything about how the investigation must now proceed. Back at the estate, Alira had spent the days of Nathaniel's absence in a strange, suspended state of anticipation, uncertain what news his return might bring, uncertain how her life might change depending on whatever truth the investigation ultimately uncovered. She had spent much of her time in the eastern gardens, finding a strange comfort in the quiet beauty of the flowering paths, away from the watchful, resentful eyes of her aunt and cousins. Draven had visited her there on several occasions, their conversations gradually growing easier and more natural as the days passed, until Alira found herself looking forward to his company, in a way that both pleased and frightened her. She understood the impossibility of whatever connection was building between them, a king and a servant girl of no remaining fortune or standing. Yet she could not deny the warmth that settled in her chest whenever he sought her out. "You seem distracted today," Draven observed, finding her seated on a garden bench beneath a flowering tree, her hands folded in her lap as she stared unseeingly at the path before her. "I am simply anxious," Elira admitted, looking up at him as he settled onto the bench beside her, close enough that she caught the familiar scent of cedar that seemed to follow him everywhere. "Nathaniel has been gone for several days now. I fear what he might find, and I fear even more what it might mean if he finds nothing at all. Whatever he finds," Draven said gently, "you will face it with the full support of the crown behind you. I promise you that, Elira, regardless of the outcome." She looked at him then, studying the sincerity in his dark eyes, and found herself, not for the first time, wondering at the strange pull she felt toward him, a connection that went beyond simple gratitude for his kindness or admiration for his sense of justice. There was something deeper stirring within her whenever he was near, something she did not yet have the words to properly name. "Draven," she said softly, using his name without title for the first time since they had met, testing the weight of the familiarity. "Why does any of this matter so much to you? You could have simply noted the injustice and moved on with your royal duties elsewhere. Instead, you have dedicated considerable time and resources to uncovering the truth of my family's circumstances." Draven was quiet for a long moment, his expression carrying the same careful consideration she had noticed whenever he weighed how much truth to share with her. Finally he reached out, gently taking her hand in his own, and Elira felt something extraordinary happen the moment their skin touched, a warmth that spread through her entire body like sunlight breaking through clouds after a long storm. "I believe," he said quietly, his voice carrying a vulnerability she had not heard from him before, "that you and I are connected in a way that goes beyond simple justice or royal duty, Elira. I have felt it since the very first night we met, though I have struggled to find the right moment and the right words to explain it properly." Elira's heart pounded rapidly as she studied his face, searching for any sign that he might be teasing her or testing her reaction, but found only sincere, quiet honesty reflected in his dark eyes. "What do you mean?" she asked softly, though some deep instinct within her already suspected the answer. "Among our people," Draven said carefully, "there exists a bond between certain pairs of wolves, one recognized through instinct and scent, long before either party fully understands its meaning. I believe, Elira, that you and I share such a bond. I have felt it grow stronger every day since we met, and I no longer wish to hide that truth from you, regardless of how complicated it may make both our circumstances." Elira sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of what he had just revealed, torn between the fairy tale wonder of his words and the practical impossibility of what he seemed to be suggesting. A servant girl, bonded to the Alpha King of all northern territories, connected by some ancient instinct neither of them had asked for or expected. "I do not know what to say," she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "You do not need to say anything yet," Draven said gently, still holding her hand within his own. "I only wanted you to know the truth of what I have been feeling, so that whatever happens next between us happens with complete honesty, rather than hidden behind careful diplomacy and unspoken assumptions." As the afternoon light filtered gently through the flowering branches above them, Elira felt something profound shifting within her own heart, an acknowledgement of feelings she had been carefully suppressing since that very first night in the crowded ballroom, when a king's eyes had lingered on her for a moment too long, setting in motion a chain of events neither of them could have fully anticipated. They remained together in the garden as the afternoon slowly gave way to early evening, speaking quietly of things that had nothing to do with investigations or forged documents or the weight of royal duty, simply learning small details about one another that neither had thought to share before. Elira told him of her mother's habit of humming while she gardened, a memory she had not spoken aloud to anyone in years. Draven told her of his own father, a stern but fair ruler who had died when Draven was barely 20, leaving him to assume the throne far earlier than he had ever expected or wanted. "I did not want this crown," Draven admitted, staring out at the fading light beyond the garden path. "I wanted, once, to simply serve as a council member, somewhere quiet, to raise a family away from the constant demands of governing an entire territory. But duty rarely asks what we want before assigning our roles in life. I understand that better than most," Elira said quietly, and something in her tone made Draven turn to look at her more closely, recognizing the shared weight of circumstances neither of them had chosen for themselves. "Perhaps that is part of what draws me to you," he said thoughtfully. "You understand duty and sacrifice in ways that most of the daughters presented to me at that ball never could. They see only the crown and the power it represents. You have only ever seen the burden. Alira considered his words carefully, recognizing the truth in them, even as she struggled to reconcile everything happening around her, with the quiet, invisible life she had led for the past 5 years. I never imagined, she said softly, that anyone would look at me and see anything beyond the servant girl carrying wine trays through crowded halls. Then everyone around you has been remarkably foolish, Draven said, his voice carrying a gentle firmness that made her smile despite the heaviness of the conversation. As evening deepened around them, a messenger arrived at the garden entrance, breathless from running, informing Draven that Nathaniel had returned from his journey and awaited him urgently in the main study. Draven rose immediately, though he paused before departing, turning back to look at Alira with an expression that carried both reluctance to leave and anticipation for what news his advisor might bring. "Will you come with me?" he asked. "Whatever Nathaniel has discovered concerns your family directly. I believe you deserve to hear it firsthand, rather than waiting for a second-hand account." Alira nodded, rising to join him, her heart pounding with a mixture of the earlier confession still settling within her chest and the fresh anxiety of finally learning what truth had been uncovered about her parents' deaths. Together, they made their way through the darkening corridors of the main house, toward the study where Nathaniel waited, with news that would soon change everything, about how Alira understood her past, and everything about how the future would need to be confronted. As they approached the study door, Draven paused once more, turning to look at her with a steadying gaze. "Whatever we learn tonight," he said quietly, "know that you do not face it alone, Alira, not anymore." She nodded, drawing strength from his steady presence beside her, and together, they stepped through the study door to hear whatever truth Nathaniel had traveled so far, and worked so diligently to finally bring to light. Inside the study, Nathaniel rose from his chair the moment they entered, his expression grave but resolute, the look of a man who had carried difficult news over a great distance and was finally ready to set its weight down. Candles burned low around the room, casting long shadows across the walls lined with pack records and old maps of the Northern Territories. "My lord," Nathaniel said, bowing slightly, before glancing toward Alira with an expression of genuine sympathy. "Miss Ashwood, I have returned with information that I believe will finally clarify the circumstances surrounding your parents' deaths. I must warn you both, what I have learned is difficult to hear." Alira felt Draven's hand find hers again, steady and reassuring, as she braced herself for whatever truth Nathaniel had traveled so far to uncover. "Please," she said, her voice steadier than she expected, "tell us everything." Nathaniel gestured for them both to sit, and as they settled into the chairs before his desk, he began to recount his journey to the distant village, his conversation with the frightened former maid, and the devastating account of what she had witnessed on the night of the fire so many years before. Alira listened in stunned silence, her free hand pressed against her mouth, as the pieces of a truth she had long suspected but never dared fully articulate, finally assembled themselves into a complete and damning picture. "She is willing to testify before the Pack Council," Nathaniel continued, once Alira had absorbed the initial shock of the maid's account, "and I have already secured her safety in a protected location under the Crown's authority. Her statement, combined with the forged guardianship documents and the missing original investigation records, provides substantial evidence that your aunt was directly responsible for the fire that killed your parents, my lord." Alira sat frozen in her chair, the words settling over her like a physical weight pressing down on her chest. She had suspected, in the quiet corners of her mind that she had never allowed herself to fully examine, that something was deeply wrong with the official account of her parents' deaths. But suspicion and confirmation carried entirely different emotional burdens, and she found herself struggling to breathe normally, as the reality of Marla's betrayal finally crystallized before her. "Why?" she managed finally, her voice barely a whisper. "Why would she do such a thing?" Nathaniel glanced toward Draven briefly before answering, as though seeking permission to share the full weight of what the investigation had uncovered. Draven nodded slightly, and Nathaniel continued. "The financial records suggest a clear motive, Miss Ashwood," he said gently. "Your father had recently discovered discrepancies in accounts that Marla had been quietly managing for the family, discrepancies suggesting she had been diverting funds meant for the estate toward her own household's use for several years prior to the fire. Correspondence recovered from the archive indicates your father intended to confront her formally before the Pack Council within days of the fire occurring." The pieces clicked together with horrible clarity in Alira's mind. Her father had discovered the theft. He had intended to expose it. And within days, he and her mother were dead, the evidence conveniently destroyed along with them. And her aunt had positioned herself as the grieving relative who selflessly took in the orphan child, all while continuing to profit from the very theft her father had died trying to expose. She murdered them to protect her own theft, Illyra said slowly, testing the words aloud as though speaking them might make the truth more bearable, though it did not. That is the strong indication of the evidence gathered thus far, Nathaniel confirmed carefully, though a formal council hearing will be required to establish this conclusively, and to determine appropriate consequences. Draven's hand tightened around Illyra's, and when she glanced up at him, she saw barely restrained fury simmering behind his otherwise composed expression, a controlled anger that seemed entirely focused on the injustice done to her, rather than any personal agenda of his own. "This will be addressed immediately," he said, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a king who had made his decision and would not be swayed from it. "Nathaniel, arrange for the Pack Council to convene within 3 days. I want the guardianship transfer, the missing investigation records, and the witness testimony presented formally and completely." "Understood, my lord," Nathaniel said, already gathering his papers with renewed purpose. "I will also arrange for additional protection around the estate. If Marla suspects the extent of what we have uncovered, she may attempt to flee before the hearing, or worse, attempt to silence remaining witnesses." "See to it," Draven said. "And Nathaniel, thank you for your diligence in pursuing this matter so thoroughly, despite the personal risk involved in traveling so far to secure the witness's testimony." Nathaniel bowed slightly before departing the study, leaving Draven and Illyra alone once more amid the flickering candlelight, the weight of everything they had just learned settling heavily around them both. Illyra remained silent for a long moment, staring at her hands, trying to process the enormity of the truth that had finally been revealed after 5 years of quiet, unexplained suffering. "They murdered them," she said again, softer this time, as though the repetition might help her mind fully accept what her heart already understood to be true. "My parents were murdered, and I have spent 5 years being cared for, in name only, by the very woman responsible for their deaths." "I know," Draven said quietly, moving to kneel before her chair so that he could look directly into her eyes. "I am so sorry, Illyra. No amount of justice can undo what you have suffered, but I promise you, the council will not allow this crime to go unpunished." Tears finally broke free from where Illyra had been holding them back, sliding silently down her cheeks as the full weight of the revelation overwhelmed her carefully maintained composure. Draven reached up gently, brushing away the tears with a tenderness that surprised her, given his usual controlled demeanor as ruler of the Northern Territories. "I do not know how to feel," she admitted through her tears. "Relief, that the truth is finally known. Grief, for losing them all over again in this new way. Anger, at everything Marla has stolen from me. Not just the estate, but 5 years of my life, spent believing I owed her gratitude for taking me in." "You are allowed to feel all of those things at once," Draven said gently. "Grief rarely follows simple single paths, Illyra. Take whatever time you need to process this. I will not rush you toward the council hearing before you feel prepared to face it." She looked at him then, this powerful king who had somehow become the steadiest presence in her life within the span of only a few short days, and felt something settle within her chest despite the chaos of her emotions, a quiet certainty that whatever came next, she would not have to face it alone. "Draven," she said softly, using his name again without title, testing the growing familiarity between them. "Earlier, in the garden, you spoke of a bond between us. I have been thinking of your words ever since, trying to understand what they might mean for both of us, given everything else happening around us." Draven's expression softened further, and he reached up to gently cup her face in his hand, his thumb brushing away a final lingering tear. "I meant every word," he said quietly. "The bond I feel toward you has nothing to do with pity for your circumstances, Illyra, nor with any political advantage your family name might once have carried. It is something deeper, something instinctive that I have never experienced with anyone else, in all my years of meeting potential matches presented by ambitious pack families." "I feel it too," Illyra admitted, the words escaping before she could second-guess their wisdom. "Something has been growing within me since that first night in the ballroom, something I did not have the courage to name until now." Draven's eyes searched hers for a long moment, as though seeking confirmation that she truly meant what she had just confessed, before he leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished. When she did not, he pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, a chaste and careful gesture that nonetheless carried the full weight of everything unspoken between them. "Then let us face what comes next together," he said quietly. "The council hearing, your aunt's judgment, and whatever future waits beyond it. I do not know exactly what shape that future will take, Illyra, but I know I do not wish to face it without you standing beside me." Outside the study window, the last light of evening had fully given way to darkness, stars beginning to emerge across the clear night sky, indifferent to the profound shift occurring within the small candlelit room below, where a broken truth had finally been spoken aloud, and a fragile new bond had taken its first tentative steps toward something neither of them yet fully understood, but both were beginning to trust with growing certainty. The following morning, Elira woke before dawn, unable to return to sleep after the revelations of the previous night, her mind cycling endlessly through memories of her parents that she had not allowed herself to fully revisit in years. She dressed quietly and made her way toward the eastern gardens, seeking the same quiet solace among the flowering paths that had brought her comfort throughout the difficult days since Draven's arrival. The garden was empty at this early hour, mist still clinging to the grass, and Elira settled onto the same bench where Draven had first confessed his feelings the previous afternoon, wrapping her cloak tighter against the morning chill. She thought of her mother, of the way she used to hum softly while tending her own small garden behind their family home, a home that had been lost along with everything else in the terrible aftermath of the fire. She thought too of her father, of his quiet insistence on fairness even when fairness proved inconvenient or costly, of the values he had tried to instill in her during their 2 brief years together. She wondered what he would think of the man she now found herself drawn toward, this alpha king who had disrupted her carefully controlled existence within days of their first meeting. She suspected, somehow, that he would have approved. A soft rustle of footsteps on the garden path drew her attention, and she turned to find Freya approaching hesitantly, her arms wrapped around herself as though warding off more than simply the morning cold. Elira tensed instinctively, unsure what to expect from her cousin after everything that had transpired over the past several days. "May I sit?" Freya asked quietly, her usual haughty confidence entirely absent from her voice and posture. Elira nodded cautiously, watching as Freya settled onto the far end of the bench, keeping a careful distance between them despite the invitation to sit. "I heard what Nathaniel discovered," Freya said after a long moment of silence, staring at her hands rather than meeting Elira's eyes. "About the fire. About what my mother apparently did." "I did not realize the news had already spread," Elira said carefully, unsure how much of the truth Freya actually knew, or how she felt about it. "The servants talk," Freya said with a humorless hollow laugh. "They always talk, though I never paid much attention before now." She paused, drawing a shaky breath before continuing. "I want you to know, Elira, that I did not know. Whatever my mother has done, whatever crimes she may have committed, I had no knowledge of any of it. I always believed the fire was simply a terrible accident, just as everyone told us it was." Elira studied her cousin's face carefully, searching for any sign of deception in her expression, and found instead something that looked genuinely like shock and grief, emotions Freya had likely never expected to feel regarding her own mother's actions. "I believe you," Elira said finally, surprising herself with the sincerity of the statement. Whatever cruelties Freya had inflicted upon her over the years, born of spoiled privilege and careless disregard, murder seemed a different category of crime entirely, one Elira did not believe her cousin capable of condoning, even in her worst moments. "I have been cruel to you," Freya said quietly, still not quite meeting Elira's eyes. "For years, I have treated you as though you were beneath consideration, simply because my mother taught me to see you that way. I do not expect forgiveness, Elira, and I understand if you cannot offer it. But I wanted you to know that I recognize now how wrong that treatment truly was." Elira considered her cousin's words carefully, weighing years of accumulated resentment against the genuine vulnerability she now witnessed in Freya's posture and voice. She did not owe Freya immediate forgiveness, she understood that clearly, but something in her father's teachings about fairness whispered that acknowledging genuine remorse, however belated, still carried value. "Thank you for saying that," Elira said finally. "I cannot promise that our relationship will be repaired quickly, Freya, given everything that has happened between us over the years, but I appreciate your honesty this morning, more than you might realize." Freya nodded, seeming to accept this measured response with more grace than Elira had ever seen from her before. "What will happen to my mother?" she asked after a moment, her voice small and uncertain. "That will be for the Pack Council to decide," Elira said carefully. "I do not know the specifics of what consequences she might face, though given the severity of what she has apparently done, I suspect they will be significant." Freya's shoulders sagged slightly at this confirmation, though she did not argue or protest the fairness of whatever judgment awaited her mother. "I suppose I always knew, somewhere, that something was wrong," she admitted quietly. "The way she managed the household finances, the secrecy around certain matters, the way she reacted whenever anyone mentioned your parents. I simply chose not to examine it too closely. because examining it would have meant confronting uncomfortable truths about the woman who raised me. That is a difficult thing to confront, Alira acknowledged, understanding all too well the temptation to avoid painful truths in favor of comfortable illusions, having done the same herself for years regarding her own suspicions about the fire. The two cousins sat together in silence for a while longer, watching the morning mist slowly burn away beneath the rising sun, an unspoken truce settling between them that neither fully understood yet but both seemed willing to cautiously explore. It was not forgiveness, not yet, and perhaps it never would be entirely. But it was, Alira thought, a beginning of something more honest than anything that had existed between them before. As the sun climbed higher above the garden walls, Alira found herself thinking once more of the council hearing that awaited them all within the coming days, uncertain what final justice would look like, but grateful, despite everything, that the truth had finally begun its slow, painful journey into the light. The packed council hall had never held so many spectators, word of the impending hearing having spread through every corner of the territory within days, drawing curious nobles and concerned commoners alike to witness whatever judgment awaited the Ashwood household. Alira stood near the front of the chamber, flanked by Draven on one side and Nathaniel on the other, her hands clasped tightly together to keep them from trembling as the council elders took their seats along the raised platform at the front of the hall. Marla sat across the aisle, flanked by two of Draven's guards rather than family members, her usual composed elegance replaced by a brittle rigidity that suggested she understood exactly how precarious her position had become. Freya and Lily sat several rows back, their expressions carrying a mixture of shame and uncertainty that Alira had not expected to see from either of them, particularly not from Freya after their quiet conversation in the garden days earlier. "This council convenes," announced Elder Osric, the eldest of the pack's ruling council, his voice carrying easily through the hushed chamber, to address serious allegations concerning the death of council member Aldrich Ashwood and his wife Miriam, 5 years past, along with subsequent allegations of estate fraud committed against their surviving daughter, Alira Ashwood. A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd, quickly silenced as Elder Osric raised his hand for order. "The Crown has requested this hearing based on substantial evidence gathered during a recent investigation. Alpha King Draven, you may present your findings." Draven rose, his presence commanding immediate silence throughout the hall as he stepped forward to address the council directly. "Esteemed elders," he began, his voice steady and authoritative. 5 years ago, this council ruled the deaths of Aldrich and Miriam Ashwood, an accidental fire, caused by a collapsed chimney flue. New evidence, gathered over the past several days, suggests this ruling was based on incomplete and deliberately falsified information. He proceeded to lay out the case methodically, beginning with the discovery of missing original investigation records, moving through the forged guardianship documents that had illegally extended Marla's control over the Ashwood estate well beyond Alira's coming of age, and finally presenting the devastating testimony of Clara, the former household maid who had witnessed Marla near the fatal chimney flue on the night of the fire. Clara herself was brought forward to testify directly before the council, her voice shaking but resolute as she recounted the same account she had given Nathaniel days earlier, describing Marla's late-night presence near the chimney, the strange package wrapped in cloth, and the swift, generous dismissal that had followed once she raised concerns about what she had witnessed. Throughout the testimony, Marla sat rigid in her chair, her face pale but her expression carefully controlled, offering no visible reaction, even as the evidence against her mounted steadily before the entire assembled council and gathered crowd. "Marla Ashwood," Elder Osric said once Clara's testimony concluded, "you have heard the evidence presented against you. Do you wish to respond to these allegations?" For a long moment, Marla remained silent, her eyes scanning the crowd as though searching for some avenue of escape that did not exist within the confines of the council hall. Finally, she rose slowly from her chair, her composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of the evidence arrayed against her. "I did what was necessary," she said, her voice carrying a note of defiance that surprised many in the crowd, though Alira had seen glimpses of this cold determination beneath her aunt's careful mask many times over the years. "Aldrich discovered discrepancies in accounts I had been managing. Yes. He intended to expose me before this very council, to strip away everything I had built for my own daughter's futures. I could not allow that to happen." A collective gasp swept through the chamber at this near admission, and Elder Osric's expression hardened considerably. "Are you confessing to the murder of council member Aldrich Ashwood and his wife Miriam?" he asked directly. Marla's composure finally shattered entirely, tears streaming down her face as years of carefully maintained deception collapsed under the weight of public scrutiny. I never intended for it to happen so completely, she said, her voice breaking. I only meant to create enough smoke to force them from the house temporarily, to buy myself time to correct the accounts before Aldrich could examine them further. I did not intend for the fire to spread so quickly, nor for them to be trapped within the chamber. Regardless of intent, Elder Osric said coldly, your actions directly resulted in the deaths of 2 respected members of this council, and you subsequently profited from their deaths by seizing control of their daughter's rightful inheritance through forged legal documents, all while subjecting that same daughter to years of cruel servitude within her own family home. Marla said nothing further, sinking back into her chair as the full weight of her confession settled over the silent chamber. Illyra felt Draven's hand find hers, steady and reassuring, as she processed the reality of finally hearing her aunt admit, in front of the entire Pack Council, to the murder of her parents. The evidence and confession presented here today leave no room for doubt, Elder Osric announced, rising from his seat to address the full council and gathered crowd. Marla Ashwood, you are hereby found guilty of the murder of Aldrich and Miriam Ashwood, and of fraud committed against their surviving daughter, Illyra Ashwood. You will be stripped of all standing within this pack, all seized assets will be returned to their rightful heir, and you will face permanent exile from these northern territories, effective immediately. The chamber erupted into a wave of shocked murmurs and whispered conversations as guards moved forward to escort Marla from the hall. As she passed Illyra's position near the front of the chamber, she paused for just a moment, her tear-streaked face carrying an expression Illyra could not fully interpret, somewhere between regret and lingering resentment. I hope you find whatever happiness you believe you deserve, Marla said quietly, before the guards continued escorting her toward the chamber's exit, her once elegant composure now entirely stripped away, leaving only a broken woman facing the full consequences of her crimes. Illyra watched her aunt's departure with a strange, complicated mixture of emotions swirling within her chest, relief at the truth finally being acknowledged mixing uncomfortably with something that almost resembled pity for the woman who had caused her so much suffering. She did not know if she would ever fully understand or forgive what Marla had done, but she understood, standing in this crowded hall with Draven's steady presence beside her, that a chapter of her life defined by fear and servitude had finally, decisively closed. Elder Osric turned his attention next toward Illyra herself, his expression softening considerably as he addressed her directly before the full council. Illyra Ashwood, he said, the council formally restores to you full ownership of your family's estate, along with the title and standing your father once held within this pack. We extend our deepest apologies for the years of suffering you endured due to this council's failure to properly investigate your parents' deaths 5 years ago. Illyra felt tears gathering in her own eyes as she absorbed the magnitude of this restoration. 5 years of stolen inheritance and stolen dignity, finally being returned to her in a single formal declaration. She dropped into a respectful curtsy before the council, her voice steady despite the emotion coursing through her. Thank you, Elder Osric, and the full council, she said. I only wish my parents could have lived to see this justice finally realized. As the hearing concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Draven guided her gently from the chamber, his expression carrying quiet pride alongside the same steady support he had offered throughout their difficult journey toward this moment. You handled that with remarkable grace, he said quietly, once they had stepped outside into the fresh afternoon air. I could not have faced any of it without you standing beside me, Illyra admitted, leaning slightly into his steady presence as the exhaustion of the day's proceedings finally began to catch up with her. You will not need to face anything alone again, if you do not wish it, Draven said softly, and Illyra understood, with growing certainty, exactly what he meant by those words, even as neither of them yet spoke aloud the fuller implications of the bond steadily strengthening between them, with each passing day. That evening, as the estate settled into an unfamiliar quiet, following the dramatic events of the hearing, Illyra found herself walking through rooms she had once cleaned as a servant, now understanding that every piece of furniture, every painting, every quiet corner of the house, belonged rightfully to her once more. The sensation was strange and disorienting, like stepping into a life that felt both familiar and entirely foreign at the same time. Edmund found her standing in the main hall, staring up at a portrait of her parents that had hung there since before the fire, one of the few items Marla had apparently not thought valuable enough to remove or sell during her years of managing the estate. They would be proud of you, Edmund said quietly, coming to stand beside her, his weathered face carrying genuine warmth as he studied the portrait alongside her. Your father especially. He always spoke of fairness as the highest virtue a person could hold, and you have pursued that same fairness, even when it would have been easier to simply accept your circumstances. I could not have done it without your kindness over the years, Edmund, Elira said, turning to look at the older servant who had remained one of her few sources of comfort throughout her difficult years within this household. You are the reason I still remembered my parents' names when everyone else seemed determined to erase them from this house's history. Edmund's eyes grew misty at her words, and he reached out to pat her shoulder gently, a gesture more paternal than any Marla had ever offered during Elira's years under her guardianship. It was my honor, child, he said. Now, with the estate rightfully restored to you, I imagine you will have decisions to make about how to proceed, both regarding the household staff and regarding your future more broadly. Elira considered his words carefully, recognizing the weight of responsibility now settling upon her shoulders as rightful heir to her family's restored estate and title. I intend to keep every member of the household staff who wishes to remain, she said firmly, beginning with you, Edmund, though I hope you might consider a position of greater responsibility than your current duties, given everything you have done for this family over the years. I would be honored to serve you in whatever capacity you require, Edmund said, bowing slightly despite Elira's obvious discomfort at receiving such formal deference from someone who had shown her genuine kindness throughout her difficult years. As Edmund departed to attend to his remaining duties, Elira remained alone in the hall, studying her parents' portrait for a while longer, allowing herself to finally grieve properly for everything she had lost, now that the truth of their deaths had been fully acknowledged, and justice, however incomplete it might feel, had finally been served. Draven found her there some time later, the candles in the hall having burned low as evening deepened into night. He approached quietly, standing beside her without speaking for several long moments, simply offering his steady presence as she continued to process the emotional weight of the day. I have been thinking, he said finally, his voice carrying a note of careful consideration, about what comes next, for both of us. Elira turned to look at him, studying the seriousness in his expression, recognizing that whatever he intended to say carried significant weight beyond their usual quiet conversations. What do you mean? She asked. The bond between us has only grown stronger since I first arrived at this estate, Draven said carefully. I do not wish to rush you, Elira, particularly not so soon after everything you have endured today. But I must be honest that my feelings for you extend far beyond simple concern for justice being served on your behalf. I know, Elira said softly, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. I have felt the same growing connection, Draven, even as I have struggled to reconcile it with everything else happening around us. Then I would ask you, Draven said, taking her hands gently in his own, once you have had sufficient time to settle into your restored position and to properly grieve for your parents, whether you might consider accepting the full bond between us, standing beside me as Luna of the Northern Territories. Elira's breath caught at the magnitude of what he was proposing, the weight of such a role settling over her even as her heart responded instinctively with warmth and certainty she had never expected to feel toward anyone, let alone a king she had met under such extraordinary circumstances only days before. I need time, she admitted honestly, to properly grieve for my parents, and to adjust to everything that has changed so rapidly in my life over these past days. But Draven, I do not wish to hide my feelings from you any longer. I believe I love you, in whatever strange and unexpected way this bond has grown between us, and I would be honored to consider your proposal once I have found my footing again. Draven's expression softened into something Elira had rarely seen from him, a pure and unguarded joy that transformed his usual composed royal bearing into something far more human and vulnerable. Take whatever time you need, he said quietly, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. I have waited my entire life without realizing what I was searching for. I can wait a little longer for you to be fully ready, Elira, however long that may take. As they stood together in the quiet hall beneath her parents' watchful portrait, Elira felt a fragile sense of peace beginning to settle over her heart for the first time in 5 long years, grief and hope intertwining in ways she had never expected possible, as she contemplated the uncertain but promising future now unfolding before her. The arrow struck the wooden post beside Elira's head with a force that sent splinters flying across her cheek, and for one frozen moment, she simply stared at the still quivering shaft before her mind fully registered what had just happened. She had been walking through the eastern gardens at dusk, alone for the first time in days, when the projectile had come screaming out of the tree line without warning. "Get down!" someone shouted, and strong arms pulled her behind a low stone wall just as a second arrow whistled past where she had been standing moments before. She looked up to find one of Draven's guards, a young wolf named Oliver, crouched beside her, his own bow already drawn as he scanned the tree line for further threats. "Stay low," Oliver instructed urgently, his eyes never leaving the darkening woods beyond the garden's edge. I will signal for reinforcements, but you must remain hidden until they arrive. Alira's heart pounded violently as she pressed herself against the cold stone, her mind racing through the implications of what had just occurred. Weeks had passed since Marla's exile and the restoration of her family's estate, weeks during which she had begun to believe, cautiously, that the worst of her troubles finally lay behind her. This sudden violent reminder that danger still lurked nearby shattered that fragile sense of security entirely. Additional guards arrived within minutes, fanning out through the gardens and surrounding woodland in a coordinated search for whoever had fired the arrows. Draven himself appeared shortly after, his expression carrying a barely controlled fury that Alira had not witnessed from him since the day he first learned the details of her years of suffering under Marla's guardianship. "Are you injured?" he demanded, kneeling beside her and running his hands carefully over her shoulders and arms, checking for wounds despite her assurances that she remained unharmed, beyond the minor scrape from splintered wood. "I am well," Alira said, though her voice trembled slightly with the aftermath of shock. Frightened, but unharmed. Draven's jaw tightened as he helped her rise from behind the protective wall, his arm wrapping protectively around her shoulders as they made their way back toward the main house, surrounded by a tight formation of armed guards. "This was no random accident," he said grimly. "Someone deliberately targeted you, Alira, and I intend to discover exactly who is responsible." The search of the surrounding woodland yielded little beyond the discarded bow and a handful of matching arrows, abandoned by whoever had fired them before fleeing into the deeper forest beyond the estate's boundaries. Nathaniel arrived within the hour, his expression grave as he examined the recovered weapons alongside Draven in the main study. "These arrows carry markings I recognize," Nathaniel said, turning one of the shafts over carefully in his hands. "This craftsmanship is distinctive to the southern territories, my lord, specifically to Alpha Vasil's domain." Draven's expression darkened considerably at this information. "Vasil has long resented my authority over the unified northern packs," he said. "If word has spread that I intend to claim Aluna without political alliance benefit, without the strategic advantage a marriage to another powerful pack family would provide, he may see this as an opportunity to destabilize my position before any formal bonding ceremony can be completed." "You believe Alira is being targeted specifically to prevent your bonding?" Nathaniel asked. "It fits the pattern of his previous attempts to undermine my authority," Draven said grimly. "If he can eliminate her before I formally claim her as Luna, he removes what he likely perceives as a political weakness in my rule. A king bonding with someone who brings no strategic alliance or military advantage to the unified territories." Alira, who had been sitting quietly near the study window throughout this exchange, felt a fresh wave of fear settle over her at the confirmation that powerful enemies now viewed her very existence as a threat worth eliminating. "What can be done?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "I will increase your protection immediately," Draven said, moving to kneel before her chair, taking her hands in his own with the same steadying gesture he had offered so many times since their first meeting. "You will not leave the estate grounds without a full guard escort, and I intend to accelerate our plans considerably, Alira. The longer we wait to formalize our bond, the longer you remain vulnerable to those who see your uncertain status as an opportunity for attack." "You wish to move forward with the bonding ceremony sooner than we discussed?" Alira asked, understanding the practical wisdom of his suggestion even as the sudden acceleration of their plans left her feeling somewhat overwhelmed. "I do not wish to rush you," Draven said carefully, "but I also cannot bear the thought of losing you to an assassin's arrow while we wait for a more convenient moment to formalize what already exists between us. Once you are bonded and claimed as Luna, the political calculation shifts considerably. Attacking you would then constitute a direct act of war against the unified northern territories, a consequence Vasil would think far more carefully before risking." Alira considered his words carefully, recognizing both the genuine danger she now faced and the practical wisdom behind accelerating their plans, even as a small part of her mourned the loss of the gentle courtship she had begun to enjoy over recent weeks. "I understand," she said finally. "If accelerating our bond provides greater safety, both for myself and for the stability of your rule, then I am willing to proceed sooner than originally planned." Draven's expression softened with relief and gratitude at her willingness to adapt to this sudden shift in circumstances. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I promise you, Alira, whatever ceremony we arrange will still honor the genuine bond between us, regardless of the urgency now driving its timing." Nathaniel cleared his throat gently, drawing their attention back to the practical matters still requiring immediate attention. "My lord, I would recommend we also investigate the possibility of informants within your own household staff. Whoever orchestrated this attack knew Alira's typical evening walking patterns through the eastern gardens, information that would require some familiarity with her daily routines." Draven's expression hardened once more at this troubling possibility. See that a thorough investigation is conducted among all staff members, he instructed. I want to know if anyone has been in contact with agents from the Southern Territories, or if anyone has suddenly acquired unexplained wealth that might suggest bribery. As Nathaniel departed to begin this new phase of investigation, Draven remained kneeling before Alira's chair, studying her face with obvious concern despite her attempts to project calm confidence. You have already survived so much, he said softly. I am sorry that even now, with your family's estate restored and justice served against your aunt, you continue to face such dangerous threats. I have you beside me now, Alira said, reaching out to gently cup his face in her hands, drawing strength from the steady warmth of his presence, despite the fear still lingering from the afternoon's violence. Whatever threats emerge from those who oppose our bond, I would rather face them standing beside you than live a safer life alone, hiding from a connection I have come to treasure so deeply. Draven's eyes softened with emotion at her words, and he leaned forward to press a gentle, lingering kiss to her lips, the first true kiss they had shared since their bond had begun to form weeks earlier. Then let us move forward together, he said softly, once they finally parted, toward whatever futures awaits us, regardless of the dangers that may still lie ahead. Outside the study window, the last light of the setting sun cast long shadows across the estate grounds where guards continued their careful search for any remaining signs of the attack. A stark reminder that even as love and justice had found their way into Alira's life after years of suffering, powerful enemies remained determined to tear that fragile happiness away before it could fully take root. Later that night, after the estate had settled into a tense and watchful quiet, Nathaniel returned to the study, with troubling news gathered from his hasty investigation among the household staff. Draven, who had remained awake reviewing security arrangements with his senior guards, looked up sharply as his advisor entered, sensing immediately from Nathaniel's grim expression that the news would not be favorable. Speak plainly, Draven said, setting aside the maps he had been studying. One of the newer stable hands, a young man named Cedric who joined the household staff only 2 months ago, has not been seen since this afternoon's attack, Nathaniel reported. His quarters have been searched, and we discovered a small pouch of Southern currency hidden beneath his mattress, along with a folded note bearing markings similar to those found on the recovered arrows. Draven's fists clenched at this confirmation of betrayal within his own protective circle. He fled after the attempt failed, he said grimly. Send trackers after him immediately. I want him found before he can report back to whoever hired him. And I want to know exactly what information he provided regarding Alira's movements and the estate's security arrangements. Trackers have already been dispatched, my lord, Nathaniel confirmed, though I fear he may have a significant head start, given the hours that passed before we discovered his absence. Draven rose from his desk, moving toward the window that overlooked the darkened gardens where the attack had occurred only hours earlier. This confirms my suspicions that Vasil is directly involved, he said quietly. A stable hand recruited and paid to provide information on Alira's routines is not the work of some random opportunist, Nathaniel. This required careful planning and considerable resources, precisely the kind Vasil's territory could provide. What do you intend to do, my lord? Nathaniel asked carefully. I intend to send a formal message to Vasil, Draven said, his voice carrying cold determination, informing him that any further attempts against Alira's safety will be treated as a direct declaration of war against the unified Northern Territories. Whether or not he is directly responsible, he will understand the severity of the consequences should such attacks continue. A bold move, my lord, particularly before the bonding ceremony has been formalized, Nathaniel observed. Some might argue it would be wiser to gather more concrete evidence before making such serious accusations. I am aware of the risks, Draven acknowledged, but I am equally aware that waiting for perfect evidence while Alira remains vulnerable to further attacks is a risk I am not willing to accept. Sometimes decisive action, even without complete certainty, protects better than cautious patience. Nathaniel nodded, understanding the weight of his king's decision, even if he harbored private reservations about its timing. I will draft the message immediately, my lord, and arrange for its swift delivery to Vasil's territory. As Nathaniel departed once more to attend to these urgent matters, Draven remained by the window, staring out at the darkened gardens where death had so nearly claimed the woman who had become, in the span of only a few short weeks, the most important person in his entire life. He thought of his own father's teachings about the weight of leadership, about the difficult balance between protecting those he loved and maintaining the stability of the territories he governed. He found Alira still awake when he finally returned to her quarters sometime later, sitting by her own window and staring out at the same darkened gardens, unable to find sleep after the day's terrifying events. She looked up as he entered, and something in her expression, a mixture of lingering fear and quiet determination, reminded him once again of exactly why he had felt drawn to her from that very first night in the crowded ballroom. "Cedric has fled," he told her honestly, settling into the chair beside her window. "We believe he was recruited by agents from Vasil's territory to provide information on your movements. I have sent trackers after him, and I intend to send a formal warning to Vasil regarding the consequences of any further attempts against your safety." Illyra absorbed this information quietly, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Will this make things more dangerous?" she asked, confronting him directly, "before we have complete proof of his involvement?" "Perhaps," Draven admitted honestly, unwilling to offer false reassurance given the gravity of their circumstances, "but I would rather risk his anger through direct confrontation than risk your safety through continued patient investigation, while more attempts against your life remain possible." Illyra reached out to take his hand, drawing comfort from the steady warmth of his presence despite the uncertainty of what lay ahead. "I trust your judgment," she said quietly. "You have protected me since the very first night we met, Draven, and I do not doubt your wisdom now, even facing threats as serious as these." "I will not fail to protect you," Draven said firmly, "regardless of what dangers Vasil or anyone else might attempt to bring against us. I have already lost too much time believing that duty required sacrificing personal happiness. I will not lose you now, Illyra. Not after everything we have both endured to reach this point together." They remained together by the window for a long while, watching the stars slowly wheel across the night sky above the estate, drawing quiet strength from each other's presence as they contemplated the accelerated path now stretching before them, uncertain of every danger that might still emerge, but increasingly certain of the unbreakable bond that would carry them through whatever challenges remained ahead. Trumpets sounded across the great courtyard as the assembled crowd fell silent. Thousands of pack members from across the Northern Territories gathered to witness a ceremony many had never expected to see in their lifetimes, the formal claiming of a Luna by Alpha King Draven. Illyra stood at the top of the ceremonial steps, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and lingering nervousness, despite the weeks of preparation that had led to this precise moment. She wore a gown of deep blue silk, embroidered with silver threads that caught the afternoon light with every slight movement, a gift from the Pack Council to honor the restoration of her family's standing. Her hair had been arranged in an elegant style by Beatrice, who had insisted on personally overseeing every detail of Illyra's appearance for this momentous occasion, tears of joy streaming down her young face throughout the entire preparation process. Below the steps, Draven waited in ceremonial attire befitting his position as Alpha King, his usual composed authority now mixed with an openness of emotion that surprised many among the gathered crowd who had grown accustomed to his carefully controlled public demeanor. His eyes found Illyra's the moment she appeared at the top of the steps, and something in his expression, pure and unguarded joy, settled the last of her nervousness as she began her measured descent toward him. Elder Osric stood ready to officiate the ceremony, flanked by representatives from pack councils across the unified Northern Territories, who had traveled considerable distances to witness this historic bonding. As Illyra reached the bottom of the steps and took her place beside Draven, the elder began the traditional ceremonial words that would formally recognize their bond before the entire assembled pack community. "We gather today," Elder Osric announced, his voice carrying easily across the silent courtyard, "to witness the formal claiming of Illyra Ashwood as Luna of the unified Northern Territories, bonded to Alpha King Draven through the ancient and sacred connection recognized by our people since time beyond memory." Illyra felt Draven's hand find hers, steady and warm, as the ceremony continued through its traditional stages, the recitation of their individual histories, the acknowledgement of their bond's authenticity through scent and instinct rather than political arrangement, and finally, the exchange of vows that would seal their commitment before the entire watching crowd. "I, Draven, Alpha King of the unified Northern Territories," he began, his voice carrying clear and steady despite the emotion Illyra could see simmering just beneath his composed exterior, "claim Illyra Ashwood as my Luna, my equal in governance, and my partner in all things. I vow to protect her, to honor her wisdom, and to stand beside her through whatever challenges our future together may hold." Illyra felt tears gathering in her own eyes as she prepared to speak her own vows, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the moment and the journey that had led her here. From a servant girl carrying broken glass on trembling knees, to the woman now standing as equal partner to the most powerful ruler in the Northern Territories. "I, Illyra Ashwood," she began, her voice steadier than she expected despite the emotion coursing through her, "claim Draven as my alpha and my bonded mate. I vow to stand beside him with honesty and courage, to offer wisdom drawn from my own experiences of hardship and survival, and to serve the people of these territories with the same fairness my father always valued above all else." As the final vows were spoken, Elder Osric raised his hands to signal the ceremony's completion, and a great cheer erupted from the assembled crowd, echoing across the courtyard and beyond, carrying the news of this historic bonding to every corner of the gathered territories. Draven pulled Alira gently into his arms, and their first kiss as formally bonded mates sealed the ceremony amid the joyful roar of the celebrating crowd. "You are truly mine now," Draven whispered against her lips, once the kiss finally ended, his voice carrying a depth of emotion she had rarely heard from him even during their most intimate private conversations. "My Luna, my equal, my heart. And you are mine," Alira replied softly, drawing back just enough to study his face, memorizing every detail of this moment she knew she would treasure for the rest of her life. The celebration that followed stretched long into the evening, with feasting and dancing filling the great hall where Alira had once served wine as an invisible servant, now transformed into the honored center of celebration as newly bonded Luna of the Northern Territories. She moved through the crowd with Draven beside her, greeting representatives from distant packs, accepting congratulations from council members who had once barely acknowledged her existence, and finding herself, remarkably, at ease within a role she had never imagined occupying. Freya approached partway through the evening celebrations, her expression carrying genuine warmth rather than the resentment Alira might once have expected from her cousin. "You look radiant," Freya said, offering a respectful curtsy that Alira quickly waved away, uncomfortable with such formality from family, however complicated their history remained. "Thank you for coming, Freya," Alira said sincerely. "I know this cannot be easy for you, given everything that has happened with your mother." "I am genuinely happy for you," Freya said, and Alira could hear the truth in her cousin's voice, a sincerity that had been steadily growing between them since their quiet conversation in the garden weeks earlier. "You deserve this happiness, Alira, after everything you endured in our household for so many years. I only wish I had recognized that truth sooner." The two cousins embraced briefly, a gesture that would have seemed impossible only weeks earlier, before Freya returned to her seat among the other guests, leaving Alira to continue her evening of celebration with a lighter heart than she had expected, given the complicated history now finally, if imperfectly, beginning to heal. As the celebrations continued around them, Nathaniel approached Draven and Alira with news that provided a final, satisfying resolution to the dangers that had shadowed their path toward this joyful day. "My lord, my lady," he said, using Alira's new title with evident pleasure, "I have received word that Alpha Vasil has formally withdrawn any further hostile action against the crown, following your message regarding the consequences of continued attacks. It appears the stable hand Cedric was indeed acting under his direction, though Vasil has denied any personal knowledge of the specific assassination attempt, claiming it was orchestrated by overzealous subordinates acting without his direct authorization." "A convenient claim," Draven said, though his tone carried more relief than skepticism at this news. "Regardless of the truth behind his denial, I am satisfied that the formal warning has achieved its intended effect. Alira's safety, and the stability of our unified territories, matters more to me than pursuing further conflict with Vasil at this time." "A wise approach, my lord," Nathaniel agreed, bowing slightly before withdrawing to allow the couple to return to their celebration. As the evening finally began to wind down, Draven led Alira away from the great hall, out into the quiet gardens where their bond had first been openly acknowledged weeks earlier. Stars filled the clear night sky above them, and the distant sounds of celebration continued to drift through the evening air as they walked together in comfortable silence, finally alone after a day filled with ceremony and celebration. "Do you have any regrets?" Draven asked quietly, as they settled onto the same bench where he had first confessed his feelings to her, an entire lifetime ago in terms of everything that had changed between them since. Alira considered the question carefully, thinking of her parents, of the years of suffering under Marla's cruel guardianship, of the terrifying attack that had nearly ended her life before this day could ever arrive. "None," she said finally, with complete certainty. "Every difficult moment led me here, to this exact point, standing beside you as your equal and partner. I would not change a single step of that difficult journey, knowing it led to this happiness." Draven pulled her close against his side, and together they watched the stars continue their slow, eternal wheel above the celebrating territories, a new chapter finally beginning for both of them after everything that had come before, filled with promise and possibility that neither had dared to imagine when their paths first crossed in a crowded ballroom so many weeks earlier. "There is something I have not yet told you," Draven said after a comfortable silence had settled between them, his voice carrying a note of careful consideration that drew Alira's full attention. Something I have been planning since before the ceremony began. What is it? Alira asked, curiosity replacing the peaceful contentment of a moment before. I have instructed Nathaniel to begin drafting new legislation for the Pack Council's consideration, Draven said, legislation that would strengthen protections for children within their own family households, requiring regular oversight of guardianship arrangements and mandatory investigation into any household where inheritance disputes might create motive for abuse or neglect. Alira turned to look at him more fully, surprised and moved by this unexpected announcement. You wish to create formal protections so that what happened to me could not happen so easily to another child? Precisely, Draven confirmed. Your suffering revealed a significant gap in how our territories protect vulnerable heirs, Alira. I do not wish for any other child to endure years of hidden cruelty simply because those meant to protect them instead saw opportunity for personal gain. I intend to name the legislation in honor of your father, recognizing the fairness he valued so highly during his own time serving this council. Tears gathered in Alira's eyes at this thoughtful tribute, understanding the depth of consideration Draven had clearly given to transforming her personal tragedy into lasting protection for others who might otherwise face similar circumstances. My father would be honored, she said softly, and so am I, Draven, more than I know how to properly express. You do not need to express it in words, Draven said gently, reaching up to brush away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. I see it clearly enough in your eyes, Alira, and that is more than sufficient for me. They remained together in the quiet garden for a while longer, discussing the practical details of the proposed legislation, Alira offering her own insights drawn from painful personal experience regarding what protections might have made the greatest difference during her own years of suffering. Draven listened carefully to every suggestion, clearly valuing her perspective as genuinely as he had promised during their formal vows only hours earlier. Eventually, as the night grew later and the sounds of celebration finally faded entirely from the distant hall, Draven rose and extended his hand to help Alira from the bench. Come, he said softly. Let me show you something before this remarkable day fully concludes. He led her through the quiet gardens toward a private wing of the main house she had not yet fully explored, one that had clearly been recently renovated with fresh furnishings and careful attention to detail. As they entered a spacious chamber overlooking the eastern gardens, Alira realized with growing wonder that this had been prepared specifically as their shared quarters, a space designed to reflect both their individual histories and their newly formed bond together. I wanted our first home together to honor both of our families, Draven explained, gesturing toward a small collection of items arranged carefully on a shelf near the window. Items Alira recognized with a sudden catch of breath as belongings that had once been her mother's, saved somehow from the fire that had claimed her parents' lives so many years before. How did you find these? She asked, moving closer to examine the small collection, a delicate hairbrush, a worn book of poetry, a simple silver locket that had belonged to her mother. Edmund kept them hidden away in the servants' quarters, fearing your aunt might destroy them if she discovered their survival, Draven explained. He gave them to me quietly during the preparations for our bonding ceremony, hoping I might find the right moment to return them to you. Alira lifted the silver locket carefully, opening it to find a small portrait of her parents together, their faces younger and happier than she remembered from her final years with them, before the shadow of Marla's greed had begun to darken their household. Thank you, she whispered, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of this unexpected gift, for understanding how much these small pieces of them still matter to me, even after everything else has changed so dramatically. They will always matter, Draven said gently, wrapping his arms around her from behind as she continued studying the precious portrait. Your parents shaped the woman you became, Alira, the woman I fell in love with the very first night we met. Their memory deserves an honored place within our home together, always. As she stood there in his arms, surrounded by small treasures rescued from her painful past and the promise of a bright future stretching ahead, Alira felt a profound sense of completion settle over her heart, the culmination of a journey that had begun with broken glass and humiliation, and had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, led her to genuine love, restored justice, and a partnership built on equal respect and shared purpose. I love you, she said softly, turning within his arms to look up into his face, more deeply than I ever believed myself capable of feeling for anyone. And I love you, Draven replied, his voice carrying the full weight of everything they had endured together to reach this moment, completely, and for the rest of our lives together, my Luna, my equal, my heart. Outside their window, the stars continued their eternal wheel above the celebrating territories, silent witnesses to a bond finally and fully realized, promising a future built on the very fairness and justice that Alira's father had always valued so deeply, now carried forward into a new generation of leadership for the unified Northern Territories. A full year had passed since the ceremony that bonded Alira to Draven before the entire assembled pack community, and as she stood now on the same ceremonial steps where she had once descended in nervous anticipation, she found herself overseeing a very different kind of gathering entirely. Dozens of young heirs from across the Northern Territories had traveled to the capital for the formal establishment of the Aldrich Ashwood Protection Council, a body dedicated specifically to investigating guardianship arrangements and ensuring no child would ever again suffer the hidden cruelty Alira herself had endured. The council will begin its first formal session within the hour, Nathaniel reported, approaching Alira with a respectful bow that had become customary over the past year, though she still occasionally found herself surprised by the deference now shown toward her by those who had once barely acknowledged her existence as a servant girl. Representatives from every pack territory have arrived, along with several individuals who have already come forward with concerns about their own guardianship circumstances. "Thank you, Nathaniel," Alira said, smoothing the deep green gown she wore for this important occasion, a color she had come to favor since assuming her role as Luna, reminding her always of the gardens where her bond with Draven had first taken root. "I want to personally speak with each of the individuals who have come forward before the formal session begins, if time permits." "I will arrange it immediately, my lady," Nathaniel confirmed, already moving to fulfill her request with the same efficient dedication he had shown throughout the past year of transformative changes within the Northern Territories. Draven found her a short while later, reviewing final preparations for the council's opening session with the same careful attention to detail she brought to every aspect of her new responsibilities as Luna. He paused in the doorway for a moment, simply watching her work, a small smile playing at his lips that Alira had grown to recognize as genuine affection, rather than the composed royal courtesy he once reserved for public appearances. "You look every bit as radiant today as you did on our bonding day," he said, moving to stand beside her, his hand finding the small of her back with familiar, comfortable tenderness. "I feel considerably less nervous than I did that day," Alira admitted with a soft laugh, leaning briefly into his steady presence before returning her attention to the papers before her, though establishing this council carries its own particular weight of responsibility. "A weight you carry remarkably well," Draven said sincerely. "The other pack leaders speak of you with genuine respect, Alira, not simply as my bonded mate, but as a leader in your own right who has transformed personal tragedy into meaningful protection for countless children across our territories." Alira felt warmth spread through her chest at this acknowledgement, remembering how far she had traveled from that frightened servant girl who had once believed herself invisible and unworthy of notice within her own family's household. "I could not have accomplished any of this without your support," she said, though she had learned over the past year to accept such compliments with growing confidence, rather than the automatic deflection that had once characterized her responses to any form of praise. As the morning progressed, Alira met individually with several young petitioners who had traveled considerable distances to share concerns about their own family circumstances, recognizing in their nervous expressions and carefully guarded words the same fear and uncertainty she herself had once carried throughout her years of hidden suffering. She listened to each account with patient attention, offering both practical guidance and the genuine understanding that only someone who had walked a similar path could truly provide. One young girl, no older than 12, reminded Alira painfully of herself at that same age, describing with careful, guarded language the strange financial arrangements her uncle had made regarding her deceased parents' modest estate. Alira recognized immediately the subtle signs of exactly the kind of exploitation the new council had been established to address, and she made careful notes to ensure a thorough investigation would begin immediately following the council's formal establishment. "You were very brave to come forward," Alira told the girl gently, once their conversation concluded. "I promise you, this council will investigate your circumstances thoroughly, and you will not face whatever truth we discover alone." The girl's eyes filled with tears of relief at these words, tears that reminded Alira sharply of her own emotional release the night Marla's crimes had finally been formally acknowledged before the Pack Council. "Thank you, my lady," the girl whispered. "I did not believe anyone would listen to me, given how young I am and how powerful my uncle has become within our territory." "Every voice deserves to be heard, regardless of age or standing," Alira said firmly, echoing the very principle her own father had instilled in her so many years before, a principle she now carried forward into her new role, with growing confidence and purpose. As the formal council session finally convened later that afternoon, Illyra addressed the assembled representatives with a speech she had spent considerable time preparing, drawing upon her own painful experiences to illustrate exactly why such protections mattered so profoundly to the future stability and fairness of their unified territories. 5 years of my own life were spent in silent suffering, she told the hushed assembly, believing that speaking the truth would only bring further punishment, that powerful people would always be believed over those without standing or protection. Today, we establish a council dedicated to ensuring no child across our territories need ever feel that same isolating fear again. The assembly rose in respectful applause as she concluded her remarks, and Illyra felt Draven's proud gaze upon her from where he sat among the observing pack leaders, a silent acknowledgement of exactly how far she had traveled since that first terrifying night of the royal ball, when a broken wine glass had nearly destroyed what little security she still possessed. That evening, after the council's first successful session had concluded and the visiting representatives had departed toward their various territories, Illyra and Draven walked together through the same eastern gardens where their bond had first been openly acknowledged, now transformed by the changing seasons into a landscape of autumn colors that seemed to reflect the fullness of everything they had built together over the past extraordinary year. I received word today, Draven mentioned, as they settled onto their familiar bench beneath the now bare branches of the flowering tree, that Freya has been formally accepted into a leadership training program within the Eastern Pact territories. She specifically requested a position focused on child welfare investigations, inspired, apparently, by the work of our new council. Illyra smiled at this news, thinking of her cousin's genuine remorse and gradual transformation over the past year since Marla's exile. I am glad she has found purpose in helping others, given everything our family's history has taught her about the consequences of looking away from injustice. You have transformed so much within these territories, Draven said quietly, studying her face in the soft evening light, not simply through the formal protections we have established, but through the example you provide every single day, of resilience overcoming cruelty, of fairness triumphing over exploitation. Illyra leaned into his familiar warmth, thinking back over the remarkable journey that had brought her to this precise moment, from a servant carrying broken glass through a crowded ballroom, to Luna of the unified Northern Territories, from a girl who believed herself invisible, to a woman whose voice now carried genuine weight and influence across the entire region. She thought of her parents, hoping they somehow knew, wherever their spirits now resided, that their daughter had finally found the justice and happiness that had been so cruelly stolen from all three of them so many years before. Do you remember, she said softly, that very first night, when you asked my name in the middle of that crowded ballroom? I remember every detail, Draven confirmed. The scent that first captured my attention, the quiet strength I saw beneath your careful diplomacy, the way my entire world shifted the moment our eyes met across that noisy hall. I never imagined then that a single glance from a king would lead to everything we have built together since, Illyra admitted, resting her head against his shoulder as the last light of day faded gently into evening across the peaceful gardens. Neither did I, Draven said softly, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. But I have never been more grateful for anything in my entire life, Illyra, than for that single moment when our paths first crossed, and everything changed between us forever. As darkness settled fully over the territories they now governed together, protecting countless children who would never know the particular cruelty Illyra herself had once endured, she felt a profound and lasting peace settle over her heart, the culmination of a journey that had begun in humiliation and fear, and had transformed, through courage and justice and genuine love, into a legacy of protection and fairness that would echo across the Northern Territories for generations still to come. A messenger arrived, just as the last light faded completely from the sky, breathless from his hurried journey across the estate grounds, carrying news that brought Illyra instantly to her feet, with a mixture of anticipation and joy she had been quietly anticipating for several weeks. My lady, the messenger said, bowing quickly before delivering his news, the healer requests your presence. She believes the moment has finally arrived. Draven rose immediately beside her, his expression shifting rapidly from peaceful contentment to focused urgency, though a small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth that betrayed his own carefully suppressed excitement. Are you ready? He asked softly, taking her hand as they hurried together back toward the main house. I have been ready for months, Illyra said, though her voice carried a slight tremor of nervous anticipation, despite her attempt at confidence. I only hope everything proceeds smoothly. They reached the private chambers within minutes, where the estate's most trusted healer, an elderly woman named Grace, who had served the Pack Council for decades, waited with calm efficiency, despite the significance of what was about to unfold. Beatrice hovered nearby as well, having grown from a nervous young attendant into one of Alira's most trusted companions over the past year, her expression carrying equal parts excitement and worry as she helped prepare the chamber for the birth of the territory's future heir. The hours that followed passed in an intense blur of effort and anticipation, Draven remaining steadily by Alira's side throughout, offering the same unwavering support he had provided since that very first night in the crowded ballroom so long ago. When their daughter finally arrived, her cries filling the quiet chamber with vibrant new life, Alira felt an overwhelming wave of emotion wash over her, exhaustion mixing with pure, unfiltered joy, as Grace placed the small bundle gently into her waiting arms. "She is perfect," Draven whispered, kneeling beside the bed to study their daughter's small face with an expression of wonder that Alira had never before witnessed from the composed and authoritative king she had first encountered a year earlier. "What shall we name her?" Alira asked softly, studying the tiny features that already seemed to carry hints of both her own gentle strength and Draven's steady resolve. "I have been considering a name for months," Draven admitted, reaching out to gently touch his daughter's small hand, one that honors both the fairness your father valued so deeply and the resilience you yourself have shown throughout everything you have endured and overcome. "What name did you have in mind?" Alira asked, curious despite her exhaustion. "Miriam," Draven said softly, "after your mother, if you find that fitting." Tears filled Alira's eyes at this thoughtful suggestion, and she nodded, unable to speak for a moment as the weight of the gesture settled over her heart. "Miriam," she repeated softly, looking down at her daughter's peaceful face. "It is perfect, Draven. Thank you for remembering her, for honoring her memory in this way. She will grow up knowing the courage of the women who came before her," Draven said quietly. "Your mother's kindness, and your own remarkable strength in overcoming every obstacle placed before you." As word of the healthy birth spread quickly through the estate and beyond, well-wishes began arriving from pack leaders across every territory, celebrating the arrival of an heir who represented not simply the continuation of royal succession, but the culmination of a transformative year that had reshaped how their society protected its most vulnerable members. Edmund arrived at the chamber door within the hour, his weathered face beaming with joy as he was permitted a brief glimpse of the newest addition to the family he had served faithfully for so many years. "Your parents would be so proud," he told Alira quietly, echoing words he had spoken to her once before, on the day her family's estate had finally been restored. "Proud of everything you have built, and proud of the beautiful family you now carry forward into the future." As the excitement of the day finally began to settle into peaceful exhaustion, Draven remained beside Alira long after the healer and attendants had withdrawn, allowing the new family a moment of quiet privacy to simply exist together. 3 generations of resilience and love finally converging into this single, precious moment. "I never imagined," Alira said softly, watching her daughter sleep peacefully in her arms, "that the girl forced to serve wine at a royal ball would one day hold her own daughter, born to lead these very territories toward greater fairness and protection for all who call them home." "Life rarely follows the paths we expect," Draven said gently, wrapping his arm around her shoulders as they both gazed down at their sleeping daughter. "But I have learned, through everything we have faced together this past year, that the most difficult beginnings often lead toward the most meaningful destinations." Outside their window, stars continued their eternal, patient wheel above the peaceful territories now governed by fairness and justice rather than fear and exploitation, silent witnesses to a story that had begun with a broken wine glass and ended, at last, with a legacy of love and protection, destined to carry forward for generations still to come.